this is Ben, and I hope everyone out there is doing well. A little bit of a different video for you today. Normally I have these produced long pieces, these documentaries that I make on specific topics. In this case, I wanted to share with you my presentation that I recently gave at the Cosmic Summit Conference that was held earlier in the year here in 2024. Now, normally, I think in a lot of the work that I do and the topics that I dive into, they're kind of like a deep dive into a single topic. I wanted to do something a little bit differently in this case and kind of cover some ground. I wanted to talk a little bit about why I think the vase work, these incredible hard stone, precision crafted vases that come to us from, pre-dynastic times, these thousands of years ago in ancient Egypt, why they're so important and how they relate to the other artifacts and architecture and sites that we can find in ancient Egypt. Along the way, we're going to take a look at several different topics. I'm going to give you a bit of an update on what's been happening with the vase scan work, with what that team's been doing. And I'm really looking at this from the perspective of out-of-place artifacts, really how they connect to the rest of what we see in ancient Egypt and in the ancient world. And I think ultimately I want to get to where the opportunities are that I think we could be looking and trying to find more evidence that might shine a light on this mysterious part of our own history. So I do take this from the perspective of what I've been calling out-of-place artifacts. And these are artifacts that show a degree of sophistication or technology that seems far beyond what we know of that were the tools and techniques used by the dynastic Egyptians. Typically, they're made from very hard forms of stone. Stone pretty much lasts forever. They come to us from both, all periods of the dynastic Egyptian civilization, certainly attributed to all periods of that civilization, right from the Old Kingdom. In fact, a lot of them, the vases in particular, come from pre-dynastic times, but from the Old Kingdom right up to the Ptolemaic period, the Greek-Roman period, and the end of the ancient Egyptian civilization some 3,000 years later, we find these artifacts that are attributed to periods all throughout that. And as I said, they really come in sizes large and small. Now, despite what I think a lot of people might think about my work, I don't just say like everything is magical, mystical kind of out-of-place artifact. I'm actually quite careful to say what I think can and can't be done by the dynastic Egyptians, because one thing, and this is something that my good friend Yusuf Aoun says a lot, is that you never want to underestimate the dynastic Egyptians. They were an amazing civilization. 3,000 years at the height of their power and wealth, they had just tremendous capability, and they built, a lot of the temples that we see at Karnak, a lot of the work there. Not all of it, I think, and we'll get into that. But they had tremendous capability and they achieved a whole lot. But there are a number of things that are really out of their reach from a technological perspective that show characteristics of sophistication, precision machining, things like this that really don't match up with what we know about that civilization. And I'm quite careful about what I say can and can't, or what is or isn't one of these out-of-place artifacts. And I kind of have three categories of characteristics, if you like, that I put these into, that when I see it or you see it in these artifacts, now that's something worth looking at and, potentially considering this could be an out-of-place artifact, something that was beyond the known capabilities of the dynastic Egyptian civilization. And the last thing I'll say here about this is that also these aren't by any means limited purely only to Egypt. We're going to focus specifically on Egypt, and the majority of this talk will be about Egypt, but I am going to show some examples and talk about a few things that come to us from other parts of the world. And you can certainly find these types of out-of-place artifacts that display some of these characteristics from all around the world, from Turkey, from India, from South America, and we'll get into a few of those examples. But the majority of this stuff does come to us from Egypt. There's really nothing else quite like it. It has the vast majority of the world's antiquities. Even just Luxor alone has something like, the region of Luxor alone has something like 1/3 of the world's antiquities just there. So there's just a tremendous amount that's left to us in Egypt, and I think most of the evidence comes from there. The first category that I kind of put these things into, or that I look for, is really that of machining, evidence for machining, particularly in the unfinished work that we can see in artifacts and architecture all around Egypt. And this, to some extent, also does show us the value of unfinished work when we find it. quite often the finished work will have things like witness marks and, machining marks, tool marks polished out of it. So you don't have an indication of what tool was used to make these marks, but in a few locations you can find unfinished work and the witness marks and signatures of what seem to be very powerful tools that have been used into some very hard stone. Right here we can see examples for things like circular saws, straight saws, very powerful tubular drills. We'll get into that topic a little bit more later on. And these are things that might not be immediately obvious to, say, an archaeologist who isn't trained or has a background in machining, but they do pop out to people that use tools like these, that leave marks like these, that they're obvious to people who work in these materials. So I'm talking about engineers, construction experts, stonemasons, people like that. And those are the people that typically get excited and do a lot of work and investigation into these realms of witness marks on ancient Egyptian artifacts. It's guys like Christopher Dunn, who was a manufacturing expert, manufacturing engineer for more than 40 years. A couple of the examples here, in fact, were pointed out and discussed by such people like that who have been on tours with me. For example, in the top left here, you can see this faceted bullnose that's made from granite. It's part of a big granite shrine or box, this incredible piece that's on the Elephantine Island that's up at or down at Aswan in Upper Egypt. And you can see these faceted lines on this bullnose, these straight lines, these faces that are the result of a tool that's been used to shape this bullnose from the granite. And in fact, we know this is not the intended final shape for this piece because, halfway up this bullnose, you can see a transition where this has been polished out. And you have this nice smooth semicircular bullnose, and all the rest of the bullnoses on the box display that smooth polished finish. But this tool is actually, these marks are showing us the tool that was used to really just shape the granite, to give it that shape. And I was there with quite a famous artist at the time, Almer Allen. He's been featured in the New York Times. His artwork goes for a lot of money. He's quite well known in the art world, and he's been working in materials like stone and metal for more than 30 years. He's an expert in pretty much all forms of machining and working in stone. He started with hand tools, literally hammering and using hand tools to physically shape the rock. Developed RSI and arthritis in his hands. He moved to power tools, handheld power tools, grinders, all those types of things, and still had problems with his hands. And these days, I believe he does a lot of his sculpting with programmable 3D CNC machines, like 5-axis mills. So you program the shape you want on a computer, and a robot essentially does the work into the stone for you. So he's an expert in all forms of machining into stone. He's spent years doing each of these different levels of machining. And when he saw this, he pointed it out to us, because I'd seen this box a number of times and I hadn't really noticed this unfinished faceted bullnose. And he was blown away by it and said, look, this is definitely not the result of something that you would do with a hand tool. This is not, a chisel's not going to do this. You're not going to get this from polishing. And again, it's not the intended result. Like, this is literally the result of a tool that was run along this thing, creating these facets that's really shaping that stone and giving it that, that faceted shape. So it's definitely not a hand tool. We don't know what made it, but we can see the witness mark from the tool right here in the stone. And likewise in the bottom right, one of the most interesting pieces of granite you'll find pretty much anywhere in Egypt. It's a big granite slab that's found at Abu Rawash. It's the northernmost pyramid site in the sun belt of pyramids in Lower Egypt, so in that Giza area. And it's a broken piece that's come off something, but this thing actually looks like it's been cut in two directions. So you have a circular saw cut that you can see here clearly indicated on that photo, but it's also concave. So it has this concave shape to it. So it's also this dipping. It's not a flat surface. It's a carved concave surface. And if you look closely at it, it's full of these striations and grooves from whatever tool was used to make it. And on my most recent trip to Egypt, I was there with a guy named Chris King. Now, if you ride mountain bikes, you're in the Washington area, you might know who that is. Chris King's been making high-end cranks and wheels and parts for mountain bikes for years. He's a precision manufacturing expert. Obviously, you have to be to make those sorts of materials and components. Very familiar with tool witness marks. I mean, he was very interested in a lot of these artifacts. I mean, he brought a magnifying glass. I've actually got a lot of good video footage of him. We've been talking about it. He's starting to do some podcast appearances talking about some of his findings. But he took a close look at this and again came to the conclusion that there is just absolutely no way this is the result of anything done with a manual hand tool. He also doesn't think that it was cut sort of in one pass, that there was a width of a tool that was run repeatedly across this thing that gave it its concave shape. And it's certainly a topic for a video that I'll probably get into in the future. But again, we can see the result of machining and powerful tools on this stone, and it's really not something that's explainable by the tools and techniques that we know were used in ancient Egypt. And as I said, these examples of what seems to be advanced machining don't come to us only from Egypt. We can also find examples of sophisticated machining techniques turning that type of thing from other places in the world. For example, there's been recently a number of interesting artifacts that have come out of Turkey. There was a portion of a polished obsidian bracelet that was found in central Anatolia in Turkey. You can see an image of what it would have looked like as a whole piece here, and then you can see the fragment of it that's been analyzed here. Now, this is obsidian. There's a piece of it. There's actually a paper you can find that is a full tribological analysis of the technique of manufacturing. Tribology being an analysis of, basically manufacturing and what it takes to make something. And it's very evident that this bracelet, or this fragment of this obsidian bracelet, was in fact turned. And the interesting part about this bracelet is that it's come from a site that's been, carbon-14 dated to the period of around 8,300 to 7,500 BC, so like around 10,000 years old, if not older. And obsidian's kind of an interesting material. Typically, it's worked in the Stone Age or Neolithic times with by knapping. You hit it with harder rock like flint, and it breaks off in these fragments, and you can get quite sharp edges. It's quite a useful tool. It was even used in South America as a weapon, like jagged fragments of obsidian were embedded into wood, and that was used as a weapon. But in order to get a smooth surface like this, and you can see from this paper, it includes microscopic analysis of the actual surfaces. You really have to turn it, and you have to be very gentle with it, because otherwise you'll snap pieces off of the obsidian. And really, the only way to achieve a shape like this is if it was turned and turned at a relatively high speed. And that's really the conclusion that this paper comes to about this bracelet. And so it's another out-of-place artifact relative to all of the other kind of Stone Age obsidian work that we can see. And by no means is this the only example that comes out of Turkey. There's another great example that I saw in a Versadoco video, which is a good YouTube channel. I think he dives into this bracelet, the analysis, and this obsidian disc, or this bowl or something like that, in that video. But you can quite clearly see how this other obsidian disc in the bottom right here was also turned. These grooves don't just... You're not doing that by hand in obsidian. In fact, if you look in the center of it where it's been damaged, you can see what happens to obsidian when you hit it and you flake it. It creates this very rough surface where big chunks of it come off. So to get obsidian this smooth and this clean, particularly in these grooves, it's 100% the result of a pretty sophisticated lathe that was used. So if you're interested in more information about machining, I've definitely dived into this topic in a lot of detail in a number of videos. I'm going to link all of these below in the description. I have my part 1 of my Evidence for Ancient High Technology playlist, which really dives into machining as a broad topic. I've got a video specifically looking at this bullnose and the box at Elephantine Island. Also looking at some of the evidence for machining and tubular drills at Karnak and Luxor temples. And then also one that dives into kind of the whole history of investigation into ancient Egyptian stone cutting, how it's explained in the mainstream, the problems with that idea, what the evidence of the stone actually says, things like that. So check those out if you're interested in more details. So aside from machining, another category of evidence that I really think characterizes some of these out-of-place artifacts is that of precision. Now, precision is quite a broad topic. There's a kind of a meta point about precision that I think applies to a lot of this stuff, in particular the boxes and vases, and that's that precision isn't really ever developed for any other reason than the pursuit of function. There's an absolute relationship between precision and function. Precision in the modern world really started with the need for naval cannons to shoot straight, and then also to develop accurate timekeeping pieces, because it wasn't until you could keep time accurately that you could go and actually, accurately measure your longitude, for example. So once accurate timepieces using precision was developed, then we were able to navigate differently across the oceans instead of just going straight up and down on a latitude and then running down an easting or running down a westing, as it was called. You can now travel diagonally and position yourself on the globe. But in order to measure longitude, you need to have accurate timepieces to do that. And then in the kind of more modern world, we know that precision really started to develop, particularly around the industrial age. Things like steam engines, you had to create pressure vessels that could contain pressurized steam, so you needed to have flat surfaces. And that's developed on to the point that, today we have these, nanometer processors, and we're packing in millions of transistors into these integrated circuits that are just tiny. And you do that, and it costs billions of dollars to achieve that. But we do that in order to gain the functional benefit of just a tiny power footprint and the efficiency of what you can do with those types of integrated circuits. So, precision's developed and pursued in order to get a functional return on it. And I think that's the case with things like the boxes and the vases. I don't think that they were just made that precisely for any other reason other than function. It's one of the main things that leads me to believe that I think these things had a function, that they were later inherited and used ceremonially and in ritual and symbolic circumstances by the dynastic Egyptians. We'll get into that in a bit more detail. But precision in general is probably the easiest way to understand it is when you think about flat surfaces or square corners. But that's by no means the only elements of precision, although we certainly see those in ancient Egypt. You can see Chris Dunn here standing inside one of the Serapeum boxes using a precision square to measure the accuracy of the corner between the lid and the walls of the boxes. You can also see the inside corner from one of the granite boxes at Lahoun that's about the diameter of the end of a ballpoint pen. Those are the easiest ways to understand precision, but there are other elements of precision that really come into defining something that's beyond the capability of handwork, and you're talking about things like symmetry and balance. For example, we see this in a lot of the vases. They're just perfectly balanced, even made from stone like diorite. You can see an example of one of my favorite vessels here in the Egyptian Museum in the top left. It seems like it's standing on the point of an egg. It's so well balanced. Another aspect of precision really is symmetry. And we see this in a lot of the statues. Like, it's certainly been documented in the statues and headjets by Christopher Dunn. One of my favorite photos, I've used this one a lot, is up here. It's the reverse transparency overlay of the so-called Ramses head that was, for a long time, on the ground at Luxor Temple. Today it's 30 feet up in the air on top of a reconstructed statue, so you can't really get a close look at it, unfortunately. But what Chris did was take a photo of it dead straight on. So really take the time to align this thing and make sure it's dead straight on the center line of the face. You take that photo, you copy it, you make them both 50% transparent. You take one of them and you flip it on that vertical axis, and then you overlay them. And that allows you to really look at, okay, you're basically laying the left side on the right and vice versa. And it lets you determine, is there any inaccuracies left to right? You can see there's two Chris Dunns in this photo on either side. And it shows that this face is just remarkably symmetrical. And that's been backed up by further analysis of these heads. We also see the similar thing in these headjets or pashents, these crowns, like the one you see in the bottom left. At least from a front-on perspective, these are complex three-dimensional art, objects. They have depth to them. But this is not something that really it never happens with modern artwork. So, for example, Michelangelo's David. It's a remarkable piece of art. It's carved out of marble. I've seen it. It certainly stirs the emotions. I mean, it's amazing. But it's not symmetrical, and you don't see that in art. You don't really even see it in nature. I mean, human faces aren't symmetrical. We have different sized nostrils and eyeballs. So to see it in these types of artifacts, and to see it particularly in stuff like granite that's of a size like this, it's really something that isn't an accident. It has to have been designed and created that way, and I think it was done on purpose. In fact, it speaks a little bit to the design of the artifact in my mind. I mean, one of the efficient ways of potentially designing this, if you assume maybe it was designed on software or on some form of computer, that you could design half the face and then mirror it, and you've got the other half of the face there, and then this gets executed in some manufacturing system. There's a lot more that is indicative of intelligent design in these artifacts. In particular, this has been shown recently in the Vase Scan project. You can see in the top right here one of the vases and the geometric analysis that's been done on them. And I think one of the most important aspects of that, we'll talk a little bit about the precision that we see in those vases in a minute, but I think one of the most interesting aspects of them, and the one that's probably the most, to me, indicative of sophisticated design, is the discovery that there is a fixed ratio relationship between the circular features of these vases. So what I mean by that is that, the circle is the most widely used primitive in these vases. If you think of the shapes that make up this one particular artifact, you can match the curvatures of any part of it to the arc of a circle, and you can then therefore draw out that circle and measure its radius and diameter, and you can then compare the sizes of those circles that go into it. And there was a discovery by a guy named Mark Vist from unsigned.io. That's his website. He's written an article on this. I'd highly recommend people check that out. I'll definitely link it down below. But he discovered something called the radial traversal pattern in these vessels, in these vases. He discovered it, first of all, on what I'd call the OG vase, the original granite vase, the first one that was really scanned and analyzed, that really opened up this whole can of worms on the vases. And what it really is it's a simple way of thinking about it without worrying too much about the math, is that, in all of these shapes and sizes of circles that make it up, from very small, in fact, the circles on this vase go from, having radii of 1.1 millimeters right up to 42 millimeters. There's a mathematical algorithm or, a scalar function that relates that ratio, that size between them. So it basically says that you can only use, so this vessel was only made with circles that match this particular algorithm or function. Just random size circles wouldn't fit. You have to be able to go, there's a fixed relationship or a fixed ratio between the sizes of these circles that make up this vase. So it's not random. It's not somebody that's just decided, well, I'm going to make a vase. I'm going to sit here with my, hammer and chisel and my rock and my sand. I'm going to polish this thing out. Analysis of the geometry of this vase shows that the radii of all the circles that have been used in its construction, and you can see the detail of some of these, they have a fixed ratio with each other, and they can be expressed by this single scalar function. It's called the radial traversal pattern. It means, the radius of circle size n equals the square root of 6/2 to the power of n, and you can scale up that n in that size up to, to +1, 2, 3, 4, -1, -2, -3, -4, etc. And the number you get is, that's the size of that circle that fits that ratio. And those are the circles that have been used in the construction of this vase. It basically shows us that this vase was designed, and it was designed mathematically. Now, Mark tested this, right? So he tested this by saying, well, now I've reverse engineered this vase and I've found this relationship. I've found this radial traversal pattern. I'm going to go into CAD and I'm going to make a vase model based purely on the mathematics. So he went into computer-aided design CAD, created a model just based on this mathematical pattern, and then he compared it to the scan of the original artifact. And what he found was it's mind-blowing. This is astonishing. One of the most amazing things to me about this whole investigation was what he found when he compared this mathematical model that's basically perfect based on the maths that he reverse engineered, and the scan of the original artifact, was that the median radial deviation from the CAD model was 9 microns. So that's saying that the average deviation in the radii of those circles was 9 microns, which is less than a thousandth of an inch, about a third of a thousandth of an inch. And at that resolution, we don't know if we're dealing with inaccuracies in the scan of the artifact, or potentially it's just a little tiniest bit of surface damage because these things are, vastly ancient. That's unbelievable. So not only does it appear that this thing was designed mathematically, it was also executed with just incredible precision to that mathematical design, such that, even with some of our best scanning equipment, we're having trouble determining, is this a problem with the scan, or is this thing perfect, or is there damage done to it, or were they just inaccurate to within 9 microns? So it's truly unfathomable. It's remarkable, as Mark says in his artifact, that consistent microscopic precision implemented across 12 different radii with fixed ratios in granite is an unfathomable achievement. And what's even more interesting about this, and this was the thing that really sealed the deal for me, is that we find it in multiple vases. We find the exact same radial traversal pattern, the same fixed ratio in multiple vases. Here are 2 more vases that were scanned. This is what's called the thin vase on the left and the spinner vase on the right. And you can see all of the circles that are drawn on these models of these vases that define its features. They all conform to the radial traversal pattern with a very, very tiny degree of, or margin of error. So when, it's one thing to find this traversal pattern and this mathematical design on one vase. But when we look at other vases and we find the exact same fixed ratio relationship between the geometric components that make these up, I mean, these were 100% designed, and they were designed mathematically. Then there's a whole other can of worms about how you actually get from that mathematical design to output, and then an accurate output, machining output. I get into that in some of the vase videos. We're not going to dive into that here, but I think that's one of the reasons that these were 100% designed with a Turing machine. They had to be. There's no other way to do it. And then they were just executed and machined with just mind-bending precision, which we can see from the scan results. So, looking at the scans, and the scan results have been ongoing. There's been more scanning of many more vases done now. And in fact, even to greater degrees of accuracy than what we've done before. I think the initial first few vases were done using structured light scanners, which gives us resolution of around about a thousandth of an inch, maybe a little bit under that. And now a lot of these are being scanned in CT X-ray machines, which really has micron level resolution, which is about a 25th of a thousandth of an inch. And the interesting thing about CT X-rays is that when you scan these vases and these stone vessels using that, you actually get the insides as well. Structured light only really gives you the outside. CT X-rays gives you the inside. So these models here of these couple of vases have been studied, and geometric analysis and accuracy analysis has been performed on them. These are standard sort of reports that are done for any industrial process. Any time somebody creates a precision part, say for the aerospace industry, in a jet engine or a rocket engine, these parts, and you want to verify that your part matches the design to within the tolerances that you've specified, this is the exact sort of procedure that you would put it through, and it takes a skilled person using the GD&T or the geometric distancing and tolerancing tools to figure that out. So you're essentially creating perfect shapes and then comparing the scan model to them. And so what you see here is I think absolutely remarkable. It shows you the degree of precision that is found in these vessels. Really, what you want to look at is things like the color coding of these bars next to these graphs. So, within the green areas, you're talking about, 3 thousandths of an inch from basically perfect, and then it gets up to about 30 thousandths of an inch in the red areas. So there's this scale, and then so the color coding on the vase shows you how much of that vase is accurate to within around 3 thousandths of an inch from what would be considered a perfect shape. And then these graphs are showing this kind of the bell curve of how much of it is accurate within those tolerances, and a whole lot of it is. Like, these things are tremendously accurate, like ridiculously precise. And there's many other ways to measure the precision of these, and I've dived into several of those in my vase videos. But the key point here is that there is absolutely no way known that you will achieve this type of precision by hand in this material. I don't care what any people think, that they say that it can be done. No one has ever proven that this can be done with that. Can you shape granite with hand tools? Yes, you can. Can you make pretty artifacts and nice looking vases by hand with in granite with hand tools? Yes, you can. You can take years and years and grind away at it, and people have tried to do that. No one has ever come not even in the same ballpark in terms of precision, let alone things like material thickness. This vase on the left, this is the thin vase. The wall thickness of the granite in the middle part of this vase is around 2 millimeters thick. That's mind-bending. And there's even examples that Flinders Petrie talked about, and you can see them in the Petrie Museum, also in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, where you even have thinner wall surfaces than that, translucent stone. This is very hard, very brittle stone when it gets that thin, but yet executed with absolute perfection and just amazing precision. Yet nobody's even come close. But, part of the whole vase scan project is to test this theory. It's like we're saying that it can't. I don't think it's possible that this can be achieved by hand. But we don't know until somebody really tries and has a go at it. And in fact, if you watch the video about the Danville inspection day when we took a bunch of these vessels to Danville Metal Stamping, which is a precision workshop, and we put it through a bunch of geometric and precision tests, we produced a report. You can find the report for that on my website. And the conclusion from this report reads like this. That based on the plate layout inspection performed, we recognize that the manufacturing precision of the 6 ancient granite vessels is comparable in accuracy to modern processes such as CNC lathe turning exhibited in the modern control vessel. So essentially saying that the level of precision that we're seeing in these artifacts is comparable to the types of things we can do with our very best machines. And in fact, it's the type of accuracy that you would expect in the world of sort of aerospace parts where precision matters. And people want things to be within a thousandth or two, things like that. We can achieve that type of precision. Typically, it's in metal. I mean, I don't know that people have really tried to do this much in these types of stone and these types of conglomerate stones like granite or diorite, where you have different materials in them. That presents a whole other level of difficulty. But the level of precision overall is definitely something that we can achieve in our modern world, but only with modern tools. And in fact, as I said, the objective is to really find out, can this be done by hand? I'm telling you that nobody's ever proven that it can be, despite some people's claims. Go and scan your stuff and let me know how you go. I don't think you can even get close. But to address the question of whether or not such manufacturing accuracy is possible by hand, we will need to expand the analysis to include both modern and ancient objects that are known to have been handmade. To this end, we're developing a study to focus on this very subject. Now, Adam Young, who is a big part of that vase scan project, he's the reason that it really got started in the first place. He also spoke at the Cosmic Summit, and I want to thank him for sharing some of his material with me, because he's been actually going down this path and saying, what does it take to make one of these? And he has hired a granite workshop company to go and give it a go. And this is using modern tools, using modern lathe tools, and we're going to ignore things like the difficulty of including the lug handles. So, for example, you can see on this vase that they machined from granite, same type of granite as the top vase. It's rose granite. No lug handles on this thing. I'd also say that they didn't even worry about the inside surface of the vessel. They just drilled out the center, so there's no shaping of the inside done on this vessel. Purely an attempt to make a nice granite vessel like this and shape the outside. Then he had that result scanned. And you can see the comparison between the modern attempt on the left here and the ancient on the right. And you're talking about orders of magnitude difference in standard deviation. And this is using machine tools, precision lathes, things like that. Now, these experiments are ongoing. We would like to continue to try and make these vessels, shaping the insides, adding in lug handles, seeing what we can do. But certainly just from this example, using a regular precision lathe and working in stone, you still end up with something that's orders of magnitude less precise than these ancient examples. And you've got people out there that are claiming that they can do it by hand. Good luck, is what I'd say. So, in terms of precision, again, we don't see this just in Egypt. We also see it in other areas of the world. In particular, something that has come to my attention over the last few years, something I'm very excited about, something I think is a true smoking gun along with these vases in terms of proof of some very sophisticated things going on a long time ago, and that is these Barabar Caves in India. My good friend Patrice Poyard and Jayan Films have gone and spent years now documenting these sites. They've been scanning these massive caves. So the Barabar Caves are a series of rock-cut granite chambers. It's kind of, I think it sounds primitive to call them caves. They're really chambers that have been cut into these granite outcroppings in a remote part of India. There's like half a dozen or more of these things. And they're, I hate to keep using the word, but they're just truly remarkable. I mean, you can see an image of one of them here. These are amazingly flat surfaces, almost to the level of like glass when they're measured with a surface roughness meter. They're symmetrical. In fact, when all of the scans that they've done in these caves, and some of these scans, you're talking about 3, 4, 5, 6 million points in the point cloud. When you cut them longitudinally and you map sort of the left side onto the right, you see figures in the 60, 70, 80% range of all points on one side matching the location of the corresponding point on the other side within 2.5 millimeters, which is astonishing when you consider the size of some of these caves. Some of them are quite large, and they're amazingly symmetrical. The polish on these caves, it's like a mirror. It actually presented a lot of difficulties in the scan process because that shiny finish on the granite, which isn't natural, would reflect the laser light. And so it's like they had to work hard to kind of get around that. And you can see some artifacts in the scan results as a result of that, which again is a normal thing when you're scanning things like this, and the scan team has gone into it. They've released an incredible documentary called Barabar. They let me host it on my channel. I'd highly recommend checking that out if you're interested in these caves, because no one knows where these things came from. There's no examples of this type of architectural or chamber making in granite in India before this. There certainly seems to have been some attempts to replicate them afterwards, very rough attempts to replicate them afterwards. Even the orthodox stories about how they were attributed and who did it really don't explain them. They basically say that one of these kings, I think in about 400 or 500 BC, gifted these caves to a religious sect so that they could stay out of the rain in the monsoon season. This guy had converted to Buddhism, and he was trying to be nice to people after he'd fought in some wars, and so he's like, hey, you guys can have these things and they'll keep you dry in the rainy season. But no one ever talks about making them. No one ever says about that, they took this long to make and we made them. It's just like, hey, I've got these caves here, they're for you now. So no one really knows. They're just an absolute anomaly, but they're incredibly remarkable. They have all sorts of acoustic properties, but the precision of these caves is what blows my mind. The results of the scans in these precisions, clearly they were intended for something else originally. They were inherited and repurposed later on, but absolutely fascinating. I can't wait to hear more about them, and I hope to get out to see these caves myself one day. So again, I have a lot more detail on precision, and we're just getting started here. But part 2 of my Evidence for Ancient High Technology playlist dives specifically into precision, talks about that relationship to function that I mentioned. I have several videos on the vases, on the initial vase, its analysis, and then as we expanded to do analysis on further vases and confirmed that, okay, this thing isn't a unicorn. Other vases display these characteristics of precision. They also have that radial traversal pattern. And then I look at some specific artifacts around Egypt, for example, the granite box at Lahoun, that even Flinders Petrie commented about. Its absolute remarkable precision. In fact, one of the aspects of precision that he mentions that I didn't talk about before, but it's just something that applies to single piece objects. These boxes, for example, aren't bolted together from multiple pieces of stone. One of the aspects of precision that is always ignored by the skeptics, the guys who are like lapping a surface flat, or they're just hammering in an inside corner on the outside of a block of stone and saying, "See, problem solved," is that there's an element of precision that relates to the relationship and the dimensionality of an artifact. So keeping one surface at one end, perpendicular or parallel to another. And, that proportionality of form, keeping it perfect when you're talking about a single artifact that's carved from a single piece of stone. You get to a point with making these things where you can't fix a mistake by removing more material. So maintaining that degree of precision on surfaces and faces relative to each other, this proportion of scale, is absolutely an aspect of precision on these artifacts, and it's one that is always ignored by the skeptics and the people that say, oh, these were always done by hand. And it certainly is ignored by the people who are trying to replicate, individual aspects of precision, like, well, you can lap a surface pretty flat. Yes, you can. Can you sit there with a piece of stone and sort of hammer away and slowly make a little inside corner that's about this big? Yes, you can. But you need to be able to do it in an artifact and keep it consistent and do it all over it. Like, that's part of the challenge. You can't just ignore the hardest aspects of these ancient artifacts and say, well, no, we've solved that problem. It doesn't make any sense to me. So the last category of I guess, technological characteristic that I sort of talk about that I think is indicative of these out-of-place artifacts, things that are beyond the capabilities of the dynastic Egyptians, is that of logistics. And here we're talking about really the biggest artifact, the biggest, heaviest stuff, because when it comes to moving heavy things, it's not like a linear increase in difficulty. I think it's been demonstrated, and I certainly don't dispute that you can, using primitive methods, move around 100, 150 tons with enough people, time, clever use of material, and effort. Certainly, I think it can be done at that level. I think it's an entirely different story once we get up to like 500, 600, 700 tons, 1,000 tons and more. And examples, we have examples within that range that come to us from places like ancient Egypt, also places like Baalbek with the quarry there and the trilithon of stones. These things are in that 1,000-ton or exceeding that 1,000-ton mark. Now, it's not just, as the weight increases, the difficulty doesn't just go up with it. It's this logarithmic curve where it gets far more difficult, like exponentially. The friction coefficient goes through the roof. You run into material strength issues. You can't just use wood now. And you've got to remember that the dynastic Egyptians, particularly in the early period and part of their civilization, and we know that there were very large artifacts moved during the Old Kingdom, or certainly they're attributed to the Old Kingdom. There's a 450-ton block on the Giza Plateau, for example, and that's part of the Old Kingdom. You've got obelisks and columns weighing hundreds of tons that come to us from that period of time. They didn't use the wheel. They didn't use animals. We know what they did because they showed us. They drew it on the wall. They used sleds and ropes and human horsepower and wooden levers. There was no force multipliers. There was no pulleys. So I think it's a legitimate question asking how in the world were they ever going to move something like the unfinished obelisk, which you can see here in the granite quarry at Aswan, still attached to the bedrock. It was never moved. It's still part of the bedrock. It was never finished. In fact, that trench in it, you can see a tiny little George Howard in a blue shirt in the trench. It's only about 2/3 as deep as that trench would need to be to actually cut that thing out and take it out of there. But you've got to ask, when you look at the surrounding landscape, how in the world are you getting that thing out of that trench? It's on an angle. You're surrounded by nothing but granite hilltops and rocky surfaces and steep drop-offs. I certainly don't think this was the only piece of granite removed from here. I think there's strong evidence that there was a piece at least this large removed in pre-dynastic times, given by what's been written on the wall after it was removed. I have a whole video that dives into that. But this thing weighs in at around 1,200 tons if it was finished. In the category of finished artifacts, we also have massive hardstone statues. There's a whole bunch of these. These are probably the most famous examples that I like to talk about, and these were also similarly in that 1,000-ton range. In the top right, we have the great, of course, it's Ramses because his name's been written onto it, but the big Ramses statue at the Ramesseum that's fallen over, and you can see the head and the top of the shoulder here. This was a seated statue where he's sitting on a throne. His hands are on his knees. And this single piece would have been easily in excess of 1,000 tons. Just the granite pedestal block that this was lifted up and put onto, that thing weighs about 650 tons, and you can work that out for yourself when you're there. All you got to do is pace it out roughly in meters, and you'll get a conservative 650 tons. Granite weighs something like 2.7, 2.8 tons per cubic meter, so you can sort of estimate the size of the granite pedestal block, and it comes out at about 650 tons. So the statue is much larger than the pedestal. So it would have been easily 1,000 tons, probably more. And one of the interesting things about the Egyptian works, and certainly the stuff in very hard stone like granite, and this comes to us also from the unfinished aspect of places like the Menkaure pyramid, is that we know that they didn't ship things or move things when they were finished. They would finish them on site. In some cases, we see up to a foot of stone still left on the outside of blocks that they would then carve away to get to the final shape. And presumably that's because, things can get damaged in transit in the process of moving them. And you don't want to be the worker or the Johnson that chips a part off this statue if it's immaculately finished and then it's being moved to the site, right? So the actual block, when they moved this thing, might have been well in excess of 1,000 tons, something like 1,500 tons. And this is by no means the only example. In the bottom left, we've got this massive granite foot that's at Tanis. This was found by Flinders Petrie. There's a couple of different pieces of this statue, but this was also likewise a single piece giant granite statue. You can see my hand is actually, my outstretched hand is smaller than the toenail of the big toe on this thing. This foot block was actually repurposed as a block in a wall. It was cut on either end and then kind of shoved in and used as a block in a wall in a later renovation on that site in dynastic times. Petrie found a few pieces of this thing, but what's most remarkable about this is I think the distance that it was moved. So where Tanis is located, you can see it's up here in the north. It's in the delta. The stone that statue is made from came from Aswan, way down here in the south. This is 1,000 kilometers. This stone, 1,000+ ton statue, was moved more than 1,000 kilometers to the north from Upper Egypt, and you're talking about mountains and cataracts and gorges. There's a river, sure, but good luck getting the whole way through that river with that thing. But 1,000 kilometers way up into the delta, and absolutely remarkable. Even the statue at the Ramesseum, you see Luxor here, and that was Aswanian granite, so that was moved probably 200-300 kilometers, if not 200 miles or thereabouts, from Aswan to Luxor. And if we go back, I think there's an even more impressive feat here when we look at this last example of one of these statues. This is the great arm of a huge statue that's found at Karnak Temple, which is in Luxor. And there's a couple things to note about this arm. In fact, the funny thing is that there was only one brief period where it was assembled like this. I've visited Karnak many times, and all you generally see these days is just the hand. You see this giant thumb and hand, and you can see it at the end here next to Yusuf. And it was only for a short period where they'd, in this big boneyard of all these thousands and thousands of pieces, where they'd finally been looking through it and putting together parts of this statue. This statue is shattered. It was a single piece statue, but they put the arm together. And then they took it away, and they put it all. They moved it all away again. I was like, ask Yusuf, why did they do that? He goes, because they don't want people asking questions. And I can understand why you might ask a question if you looked at this and thought, my God, this was a single piece statue. Not only was it a single piece statue, it was a standing statue. These other ones were likely seated. We don't know what the one at Tanis was because all we've got is the foot. This one at the Ramesseum was definitely seated, where his hands are on his knees. But when your hands are on your knees, your elbows are bent. And this was a straight arm. So if you think of all of the big statues in Egypt, the standing ones, their arms are straight. So this guy's arms are straight. So this would have been a standing statue. This would have been enormous. Not only that, but the stone this is made from, it's not granite, it's composite quartzite. And composite quartzite is an even, in some degrees, harder stone to work than granite. Yusuf calls it like a stonemason's worst nightmare. It has chunks of flint in it, like big chunks of flint. And if you look closely at this thing, if you're ever there, you can see the big chunks of flint that have just been machined as perfectly as the rest of it. But it makes it just an absolute nightmare to work. And the source for this stone is not actually down here in Luxor, where the Karnak Temple is. It's from Cairo. It's from the Red Mountains, which is actually to the north of Cairo, a place called the Red Mountains. So this is the source up here in the north is where they get the quartzite stone from. A lot of the quartzite, a lot of it was shipped, and it was used way down here in the south in Luxor. So this is the crazy part about this is that the Nile flows to the north. So if you can imagine, all right, you want to ship some big stone, maybe you'd use the river. The river flows to the north. You're now talking about moving 1,000+ ton block of stone from the Red Mountains upriver, uphill to Luxor. And this was just no problem for these dynastic Egyptians. Okay. So you can see why, I think you can see why there's something to say about these artifacts being a little bit out of place. But if you want more information about some of these logistical topics, I've certainly got into them. Part 3 My Evidence for Ancient High-Tech series is on quarrying and logistics. I get into that artifact, that obelisk-sized piece that's come out of, I think that's come out of the quarry. In this video, larger than the obelisk. I look specifically at the colossal statues in a video, and then we get into the unfinished obelisk itself and the scoop marks and all that sort of stuff in the scoop mark video. So check those out if you're interested. But so, how are these things explained, right? You've got examples of remarkable machining with powerful machines. You've got mind-bending precision on all sorts of artifacts, small and large. And then you have these logistical feats that have been achieved on blocks of stone weighing more than 1,000 tons that have been moved 1,000 kilometers. Well, if you ask the archaeologists and you ask the mainstream and the textbooks, this is what they tell you. This is how they did it. These are the tools that were found in the archaeological record. Very primitive tools. Flint chisels, pounding stones, copper and bronze adzes and chisels and things like that. Half of these are probably only not even used in stone. They'd be used in wood or plaster. But this is what we found as far as evidence from the dynastic Egyptian civilization. And I should emphasize that it is astonishingly rare to find metal. Not only does metal oxidize and corrode over thousands of years, it's also very precious, or it was much more precious than it is today. And in fact, if you found metal in the ancient world, one of the reasons they called it the Bronze Age is because people were smelting and making bronze. And if you found metal, like, it's a very difficult process to extract metal from ore, and not that many people were doing it. But if you found finished metal and it was not in a shape that you had already wanted, whatever tool or weapon that you wanted, you would melt it down and recast it and use it as, and put it into a different form, no matter how sophisticated or lovely the artifact was. In fact, this continued right up until, relatively modern times. I mean, the Romans, there's, in the Catholics, when they took over Rome, they melted the huge bronze portico that was on the Pantheon in Rome, and it became the big bronze effigy that's over the top of St. Peter's tomb in the Vatican. We would do this all the time. If you found metal and it wasn't in the shape you wanted, you took it and used it. So finding metal is a rare occurrence. A lot of people ask, where are the tools and whatever, and why don't we find more metal? It's because it's precious, and it was sought after, and it was used, and you could take pretty much all of the metal that's been found across all of ancient Egypt and fit it into a pretty small room, not counting gold and silver. I mean, they found literally hundreds and hundreds of kilograms of that stuff. It's useless as a tool. It's decorative. Obviously, it has its value, but it's not useful as a tool. But, things like bronze, copper, steel, iron, all very useful as tools. So, these are the tools, though, that we know were found. And these were the ones that were no doubt used by the dynastic Egyptians. And not only that, we know how they used them because they painted them. They showed us how they did things. They drew scenes on the wall. And this is a scene on the wall that's found in one of the tombs of the nobles that you can get to if you go over to the tombs of the nobles on the West Bank at Luxor. And you can tell it's pretty primitive, right? They're using hand tools, they're pouring mud, they're making mud bricks in this scene is what they do. They're cooking stuff over a fire, they're hardening up mud bricks. And this is a scene of them basically making mud bricks to make mud brick ramps, to create the ramps that they use to build temples like Karnak and Luxor, even potentially making the mud bricks with which they made pyramids out of. They made many mud brick pyramids over time. But one thing you can obviously see from this is that it's human horsepower, it's manual labor, it's nothing super sophisticated. We also have scenes like this one, which shows them making vessels. And they're doing this with, a very primitive methodology. They're using bent sticks with weights on them and flint tips to rotate and turn. They're polishing things by hand. They're rubbing out the insides of these vases. And what this is showing, and we'll get into this in a little bit, is them making alabaster vessels. It's making the artifacts that do match these tools and these techniques, because that's one of the things that comes out of this that I've noticed over the last decade or so of looking into this, is that while these tools and these techniques can't explain the out-of-place artifacts, these significantly advanced things that show, machining, precision, the logistical achievements, there is endless examples of artifacts that do match them. And you can line this up and look at it across every category of artifact in ancient Egypt. And we're going to do exactly that. So it's something I've been calling my tale of two industries. So on one hand, when we start with the vessels, we obviously have the ones that I've been talking about for a long time now. The remarkable hardstone vessels made from porphyry, diorite, schist, corundum, granite. The list goes on. You can see the translucent sides of this very thin vessel with, sides down to 2 millimeters. The schist disc, things like that. Very large vessels, very small vessels. This little jade or green tourmaline vessel here in the center is about the size of the end of your thumb. Remarkable precision. We know all about it. Can't be achieved with those tools and techniques. Yet there are many vessels that can. In fact, that's the scene on the wall. What they're showing you is the creation of these vessels, these alabaster vessels. After the Old Kingdom, pretty much the hardstone vessels go away. Everything on from that point is alabaster. You can see here, some of them are remarkable. They're very pretty. Alabaster is a much, much softer stone than granite or diorite or things like that. I think it's like a 3 or a 4 on the Mohs scale. Much more easily worked with flint and copper and tools like that. It's a much more homogeneous material, so it's you can shave it and shape it much more easily than you could something with bits of quartz or rock crystal embedded in it. But you can see, as pretty as the results are, they're clearly not symmetrical. They're not paper thin. They don't have the same set of attributes that we can observe on the hardstone vessels. And not only that, but I want to introduce this other concept to you here, and that is one of imitation, because I think a lot of what we see in ancient Egypt is, in fact, imitation. If you accept for a moment the hypothesis that much of these sophisticated artifacts were inherited. They're older. Let's just assume for the sake of argument they're older, and they were inherited by the dynastic Egyptians. I think what we see in a lot of cases is imitation. Obviously, if you're working in stone or you're making artifacts like vases from pottery, if you find this hardstone vessel made from diorite and its perfection, you are immediately going to recognize the value of it, and it's going to filter up through social constructs and orders to get to the top of the social order. They'll become valuable, and then people will imitate them because they'll be magical artifacts. They would have come from the gods, right? And that's exactly what we see. And you can see this here as an example with pottery. This pottery is imitating the hardstone vessel found in the same site. It's hand-thrown pottery and it's painted to look like granite. We see this same example in the vessels in all these other categories of artifacts. We see it in the statues. One other thing I'll just mention before I go on is that the other element of these precise and remarkable sort of the precision industry side of things is that they're tremendously old. They always seem to be just the oldest thing, and that's certainly true in the case of the vessels, and I think it's one of the reasons they're a real smoking gun in terms of evidence, is that they're incontrovertibly pre-dynastic. Like these come to us from pre-dynastic times, no question, no argument on that from the mainstream guys. We see the same thing in the statues, right? These are some of the oldest statues attributed. Some of these are Old Kingdom statues. This is Khafrean throne. This one on the right was also found in the Valley Temple. It's from the Old Kingdom. I think the one on the left might be attributed to the Middle Kingdom due to some very poorly inscribed hieroglyphs that are on it. But these also show just remarkable work in very hard types of stone. This knee on the left is probably one of the best knees in stone sculpture you'll ever see, let alone in a stone like basalt or granite. The Khafrean throne's made out of diorite, and these things have just perfectly polished, beautiful finishes to the stone. Very difficult to suggest that these were made with the sort of hand tools that we see, but there are lots of statues that were. You can go all through the museums, and you can find examples of handmade statues that were made with pounding stones, flint chisels. These are still beautiful pieces, the result of artisans and guilds and probably generations of work developing the capabilities to create some of these things. And again, don't underestimate the dynastic Egyptians. For example, this one on the left here, this young Ramses being protected by the god Horun, is one that some people look at and go, well, that's amazing. How dynastic Egyptians couldn't have made that. They definitely did make this. It's a huge basalt statue. The top of the falcon or the Horun's head has been replaced in modern times. It was damaged. This is a modern edition. But you can see, if you look closely at this statue, as big as it is, and as impressive as it is, the finish is not at all like those other statues we just saw. You can see the tool marks. You can see the impacts from how they finished this stone off. And probably more interesting, and it's a topic I've certainly talked about in the past, the finishing of that stonework is exactly the same as the finishing on the hieroglyphs and on the attribution. I actually do think Ramses had this statue made of himself. We don't see that on these other artifacts. The finishing and the technology involved in making the object itself is not reflected even remotely in the hieroglyphs that have been written on it. And of course, it's from the hieroglyphs that everything is dated and related into the story of history. The hieroglyphs are very primitive relative to the statues themselves. I think this is only reinforces the possibility that many of these were actually inherited and they're older and they didn't have writing on them when the dynastic Egyptians found them. Same thing with the boxes. We have these incredible hard stone boxes. You have them in the Serapeum, we have them at Lahoun, we have them underneath the Giza Plateau. This box in the bottom right is a precision stone box made from dacite, this black one. Nobody knows of any dacite quarries in Egypt at all. It's beneath the causeway at Giza. It's Old Kingdom, like at least 4th dynasty. So these are examples that come to us from the very earliest times. In fact, the oldest known box is also a precision carved granite box. Weighs about 13 tons. It's found underneath Mastaba 17 at Maidum, and it's attributed to the 3rd dynasty. Again, these are just remarkable. And you can also find examples of handmade stone boxes. These absolutely match the tools and techniques of the dynastic Egyptians. You can see this is the result of trying to make granite boxes and actual sarcophagi by hand. Also limestone boxes. You can see the clear difference, right? You've got a primitive industry and you've got a more sophisticated industry. Only one of those two is explained by the tools and techniques in the archaeological record. Same thing with the columns. Incredible columns, huge, massive single-piece columns. You find these things at Tanis. You find them in the Old Kingdom. You find these same palm-shaped, lotus-shaped, flared columns at Saqqara, at Abu Sir, on these Old Kingdom sites. Again, these come to us from some of the oldest known sites. You certainly see a lot of them that are on sites that are attributed to the New Kingdom. Places like Karnak, Luxor, Tanis, although all of these sites also have histories that go well and truly back into the Old Kingdom. And these are absolutely incredible feats of engineering. I mean, if you look at column making, so the Romans and Greeks typically made columns by stacking up rounds, but they did also make single-piece granite columns. Like, for example, the Pantheon. The Romans made the columns of the Pantheon. They even documented how they made them. They're not anything like as precise as these columns. They've actually been studied quite extensively. And they would start thick at the bottom and they would taper up to the top, and then they would put a separate piece on top as a headstone, like a flared decorative thing on top. These Egyptian columns are something different. You can see this flared end piece of this just remarkable column that's at a site called Bastet up near Tanis in the Delta. And it shows you this, this is all one single piece, and it was flared. And this is what they all originally looked like. This just happens to be one of the best preserved examples. But in order to make this, you have to cut a piece of block that's as wide as the widest part of this, and then somehow machine that down where it starts, thick at the bottom, and it gets narrower and narrower as you go up, and then it flares out again at the top. And then while doing all of that, keep it precise, symmetrical. And it's like they stamp these things out in a factory or something. I mean, they are astonishing. And like I said, they also come to us from some of the earliest known times in the Old Kingdom. How these were done in the New Kingdom is a little bit different. Although we see these granite columns attributed to the New Kingdom, most of the New Kingdom work that we know was done in the dynastic Egyptian civilization was made from sandstone. And it was made, you can see here on the left, this is an example of an unfinished column. They would stack up blocks of sandstone, in some cases square, sort of half round, and then you would cut it and shave it down so it gets that column shape. You can also, and then you would plaster over it and you would draw your hieroglyphs on it. You can also see the pretty clear indication of imitation happening here, where you're imitating that flared shape of some of those older and much more advanced single-piece granite columns. I love this photo that you can see this for yourself if you ever go to Luxor. A lot of these old sites, these New Kingdom sites like Karnak and Luxor, I think they have been built around older granite infrastructure, and typically the core of these sites is made from granite, and this is the case here at Luxor, where you have a granite pillar or column, and right next to it is the sandstone column that is, to my mind, clearly imitating the older granite column. Even though it's bigger, it's orders of magnitude less difficult to achieve than the single-piece granite column on the right. And once again, when you look at these columns at places like Luxor, you see the hieroglyphs that have been carved into them are very primitive relative to the rest of the artifact. Same thing with obelisks. Obviously, we know about obelisks. There's massive obelisks on sites like Karnak and Luxor, some like Hatshepsut's obelisk over here, 450 tons. A lot of people seem to think that obelisks are only really the product of the New Kingdom. This isn't true. I've heard that said by a number of people, but one of the oldest sites out there is a site called Abu Ghraib. It's an Old Kingdom site. It's called a sun temple. It's never been thought of as being a necropolis or a pyramid. You can see a picture of Abu Ghraib here. What's left here looks like a pyramid. It's not. This isn't controversial at all. This was the base for what was probably the largest obelisk known in Egypt. In fact, the obelisk today is gone, but on a piece of granite near this incredible calcite Hotep that's at that site, you can see it's actually there's a carving of what it looked like. And you can see the size of this obelisk was immense relative to the size of the base. You can see the base here and the obelisk here. But these certainly were things that existed in the Old Kingdom. And again, you can find examples of imitation or later obelisks that are nothing as sophisticated or as precise as the probably better known examples. Same thing with the pyramids. The oldest known pyramids are the massive stone pyramids that are still standing. I mean, we could sit here and I can talk for 2 hours just about the pyramids, but these are some of the first pyramids ever made. These huge stone ones that show just amazing engineering, all of the different features and aspects of the Great Pyramid and the other pyramids at Giza and Dashur and Maidum. Just astonishing. But these are the first pyramids ever made, apparently. They're the oldest ones. The Egyptians kept on making pyramids, apparently, but they just didn't make them out of stone anymore. They made them out of mud brick, which far less sophisticated, much smaller, nothing like as precise, and all slowly eroding away out in the deserts of Egypt right now. You can see examples of it. So again, we have this tale of two industries even on architecture, and we can see it on some of the sites themselves. And we're going to look at this in a bit more detail later on. But you can see this quite clearly even at places like Giza when you compare things that are all supposedly 4th dynasty. These are all pictures of what were supposedly 4th dynasty works. The incredible cornice blocks in the Valley Temple and the massive, huge pieces of limestone that make that up. Yet on the other side, this is also 4th dynasty work, apparently done by the same people, as is the structure below it, and comparing things like levels of erosion, block size, sophistication. These are two entirely different construction styles, two entirely different industries. It's very difficult for me to accept that it was the same people that made them in the same time period. So, how does all this relate to the vessels? So, getting back to the vessels, because I think these are the things that provide kind of the real link between these artifacts and this tale of two industries. Hence, I think they're a smoking gun. We know that the vessels were machined. We know they were precise. And we know they were machined, and Flinders Petrie was really the first one to observe this, because a lot of these vessels and these fragments of vessels have machining marks still in them. Like the things we talked about originally. Petrie documented them extensively. You can see a photo of Chris Dunn here handling and examining fragments of vessels and vases in very hard stone, the exact same ones that Petrie documented in his Pyramids and Temples of Giza, a book he published in 1883, where he talked about the fact that lathes were undeniably used in the construction and manufacturing of these vessels. And he says that the lathe appears to have been as familiar an instrument in the 4th dynasty as it is in modern workshops. The diorite bowls and vases of the Old Kingdom are frequently met with and show great technical skill. There's no question that these things were manufactured. It's sort of a meta point, but it's one that always has fascinated me, is that it took our civilization up until the industrial age when Flinders Petrie was doing his work, I consider Petrie to be the first guy to really apply kind of modern engineering techniques to the mysteries of ancient Egypt. But it took us up until the industrial age to even have the context to understand what it is we're looking at. That's incredible. Like it's like imagining the analogies like a cell phone that you take back in time, just to the 50s or 100,000 years ago. It doesn't matter. But it's like you can just give a cell phone to someone, and I mean, you and I can't make it. But you and I have the context to understand what it is, because we know what wireless networking is, a touch screen, little cameras, microphone, the internet, all those things that together we have an idea of this context. We can understand what a cell phone is and what it does. If you just take that device back in time, give it to someone, they just look at it and go, all right, it's a piece of black glass or something. It shatters when you smash it on a rock. I mean, you just don't have the context to understand what it is you're looking at. And our civilization was lacking that context for evidence like machining marks up until the industrial age. I happen to think we're still missing context from a technological perspective when we look at some of these artifacts like the vases for their overall purpose. But just the machining marks, the tubular drills, all that stuff, we lacked the context to even understand what it is or how to think about it until the industrial age. It's remarkable. Only a couple hundred years ago has been the period where we've had enough context to where we're doing machining in materials like metal and stone to understand, this has actually been machined. It's kind of like what we're doing. And how did this happen back then? And Petrie was the first guy to understand that. So we know they were machined. We know they were precise, right? This is footage from the Danville inspection when we took these vases and put them on rotabs and measured them. But one of the interesting things about these vases is that we 100% know that the tubular drill was used in their construction, probably as the first step. So you have your chunk of rock you want to make a vase from. Probably the first thing you do is you core out the center of it. You use that tubular drill to run out the center of it, and then you start shaping everything else. And we know this because there's plenty of vases where we have the imprints of tubular drills. Here's an example of a diorite vessel that was found that I found at beneath the step pyramid of Giza at Saqqara. Clearly, the imprint of a tubular drill. We even have the tube drill cores from vases have been found. But tubular drills were 100% involved in the manufacture of vases. That's kind of the point here. And these tools seem to be a very powerful tool. We're going to get into tube drills a little bit here. You find them on Old Kingdom sites, particularly sites like Abu Sir, Abu Ghraib. You see them at Giza. You see them at Saqqara. They're all over the place. And they are typically made into very hard forms of stone, granite, basalt, diorite. We see them on statues, things like that. In a lot of cases, in the photos and documents or documentation of tubular drills and tubular drill holes that you'll see, you often see half a hole like this, which is always some people are like, okay, it's interesting. You just like, we've got half a hole here. The original people who made this hole, they weren't chasing half a hole. They were making a whole hole. What's happened here is that all of these stones have been quarried. So, I'll talk about this a lot too. Over thousands of years, these sites have been used as a source for these types of stone. And the quarriers, the people that would come along and destroy these sites and take stone away, they were looking for tubular drill holes, because you're basically weakening the stone when you've cut into it. So they would go around to the back of a block with tube drill holes in it. They would cut their little indents in. They would hammer the wood in. They'd make it wet. They'd do that, wedge and chisel or wedge and feather approach, and they would split the stone block. They were trying to do it along the axis of these tubular drill holes. And so hence you see a lot of blocks that have been split down the center of the hole, because the quarriers and the recyclers were looking for these things to make it a little bit easier for them to break off, solid chunks of stone, because usually these blocks of stone are massive. But by all accounts, these seem to be very powerful tools. They have these deep, these deep grooves that are made into the stone as a machining witness mark, right? As a result of the process. These holes range in size. We can see them all over the place, from very small. These are, you can see here, this is on the lip of a box that you can find in the Cairo Museum. Probably about a ½ inch in diameter. It's just been repeatedly run into the granite. You can see the box here, right up to very large tubular drills, right? So ½ inch up to top right here is one of my favorite pieces of stone at Karnak. It's a probably a 9-inch, maybe a little more, tubular drill that's been made into granite. Below that is a basalt inset of a box that's clearly been made with at least 4 very large tubular drills. I've not seen this thing since probably 2016. I hope it's at the new museum. I've only seen it once or twice. But, these are very large tubular drills. And then on a recent trip to Karnak, we found what I think is the largest tubular drill hole that I've ever seen. It certainly is the largest one I've ever seen. It might be the largest one in Egypt. I don't know. It's yet to be determined. But this is found right at the very fringe of the site. So Karnak's just a massive temple, huge site. And a lot of the work, the sandstone work, these huge pylons and gateways, this is all done by Ramses in the New Kingdom. I think in a lot of cases was done rebuilding and over the top of older granite infrastructure. It's all these big sandstone arches and pylons. But if you go right out to the very end along the axis of the site, you can find here a huge granite gateway, all from granite. So all the stone in this video and this image is granite. And across the top, there's these big beams of granite. And right at the very top, you can see something like, I think it's 20 to 24 inches big circular hole. Probably as a hinge for a gigantic set of doors. What the hell was going on here, I don't know. But this is a monstrous tubular drill hole into granite right at the very edge of Karnak. So very large. And by the way, not for nothing, but imagine the process of how this hole was made. So, obviously you are removing a core from the hole after you cut it. How in the world are you snapping this core off in a hole like this 9-inch hole in granite at Karnak? Open question, I guess. So these were a functional tool, as I mentioned. The big pylon at Karnak might have been used as a hinge point for a door. You see on a lot of the lentil blocks in places, you'll see tubular drill holes clearly intended as hinge points for doors. A lot of the tubular drill holes are also indented, so they're inset already. So you can see here on this piece on the left, there was something that was probably inset into that was using those tubular drill holes as a way to attach something into that stone piece. And unfortunately, on most of these sites, the stonework's just all jumbled about. You really have no idea what's what and where it was originally. But I think they were a functional tool. They were either used for, specifically functional reasons like this for door hinges or for something else being attached, or they were used for material removal. So this is still how woodwork is done, for example. If you want to hollow out a box in a bit of wood, you use like either a drill or a tubular drill to make the cuts and then knock the wood out. We see the same thing happening in stone. Obviously, I talked about the vessels. You would do that to remove the material from the center of the vessel. This top right is actually the image from inside a really large stone vase. It's about hip height. And you can see around the edges the impression of at least 3 or 4 different tubular drills that were run down to remove that material from the inside. The great crystal Hotep of Abu Ghraib was similarly shaped like this. If you look on the inside of these white calcite corners around the points on the Hotep, you'll find the indentations of tubular drills where it was run into the stone here and here and here, and that stone was removed. And again, here's a fragment of a vase that pretty clearly shows the indentation from a tubular drill, a vase or a dish or a plate or something that was used to make that original shape. So tube drills were involved. The tool was also very thin, so we can see that from these half holes that we've seen. So obviously the one at Karnak's also a good example. Right at the edge here, you can see how thin the tool was that ran past what's left of the hole. Same thing over here. This is into, I think, black granite or basalt at Abu Sir. Very thin tool, so whatever was cutting through that stone was quite thin. And this also should tell you a little bit about the process of how this tool worked, in that it was a tubular drill. You'd cut down and it left a core that was then snapped off. How a core the size of this thing is like a tank stopper. It's like one of those bollards that comes up out the front of embassies to stop vehicles. It's about that width. I don't know how you snap that thing off out of that hole, but evidently it was snapped off out of that hole at some point. That's how that tool worked. And as a result, you get tube drill holes. You also get tube drill cores. And, we've found several of these cores. Flinders Petrie's found them. Other people have found them. This is a great example in the Petrie Museum of an enlarged hole So you started with this one tube drill hole, and then they said, well, this hole isn't big enough, so we're going to cut another one. So you end up with a tube drill hole in a tube drill core that's pulled out. Really interesting piece. And then, of course, there's the famous one, Petrie's core number 7. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this guy. This is located in the Petrie Museum. By no means the only core to have been found, but certainly the one that has stirred up the most controversy over the years, because this thing has sparked a 150-year debate about what its features are. And Petrie started this when he wrote about it in the Pyramids and Temples of Giza in 1883. You can see why they call it Petrie's core number 7, because it's artifact number 7 on the page where he was drawing a lot of the artifacts that he was talking about in this book. And you can also see it's not the only drill core here. Number 10's also a drill core. Number 9 is a drill core still in a hole. You've got all of these other artifacts that also show machining marks and deep grooves from the process that he also talks about. But specifically what he wrote about core number 7 was this. On the granite core broken from a drill hole, other features appear, which can only be explained by the use of fixed jewel points. Firstly, the grooves which run around it form a regular spiral, with no more interruption or waviness than is necessarily produced by the variations in the component crystals. This spiral is truly symmetrical with the axis of the core. The great pressure needed to force the drills and saws so rapidly through the hard stones is very surprising. Probably a load of at least a ton or two was placed on the 4-inch drills cutting in granite. On the granite core, the spiral of the cut sinks 0.1 of an inch in the circumference of 6 inches, or 1 in 60, a rate of ploughing out of the quartz and feldspar which is astonishing. End quote. So Petrie was saying a couple of things about this core that are very interesting here. One is that he's noticing it's a spiral groove that runs around the core. He is very, very firm about this. He's obviously examined it in detail. He's talking about it. And he thinks that in order to make that penetration rate, which is a 1 in 60 rate, so basically if you take the circular motion of that tubular drill out, you stretch it out to 6 inches, which is what it takes, to do a full rotation in a straight line, it drops 0.1 of an inch down and in depth. It's a 1 in 60 rate. So you take 60 inches of horizontal travel, you get 1 inch of vertical travel. And he's saying that in order to do that, you needed a pressure or a weight of at least a ton or two on top of a 4-inch drill core. He's just guessing here. But remember how thin that tooltip was that we saw on some of the other examples. And if you can imagine a bronze tube or a copper tube that's about that thickness, that very thinness, and you try and put a ton or two on top of it, it's just going to fold. It's not cutting anything. But what's interesting here is the observation about the spiral groove. So is it actually a spiral groove? This, Petrie had some pushback back in the day from his peers about this. There's a bunch of letters that he wrote between his peers and him debating this. He was always very firm that it was indeed a spiral groove, but this core still exists, so you can go and test it. In fact, Christopher Dunn did do exactly that. He went there in the early 2000s with Malcolm McClure and Nick Annies, and they did what's a basic, simple observational test called a cotton wrap test, where you take the core and you look at it under a magnifying glass and you find the groove and you start wrapping cotton thread around it very, very carefully. You just follow that groove and you stick a cotton thread into it. And sure enough, it seems like it's spiral. This exact same test was repeated in 2019 by aerospace engineer Eric Williams. Eric's picture from this is on the right in the yellow with the yellow thread. And what Eric said about this was yeah, it's definitely a spiral. He said I wrapped it around it about a dozen times, got bored, and then said, what else have they got in this museum? So it seems like it's a spiral groove. However, Chris Dunn went one step further. He said, all right, let's find a way to take what is essentially a truncated cone. That core is a truncated cone. If you look at it, it tapers, right? So it tapers from the top to the bottom. It's a little less. It's shaped like this, which is interesting because the holes are straight. So it makes me think that whatever tool cut them was also tapered, and it was tapered for a specific depth, which also means that these grooves can't have been made when that tool was withdrawn from the hole. Because if you think of something's, If the hole's like this, and you have a taper like this, and then the tool on the inside is tapered like this, as it cuts down, it's a specific depth tool. Like, it only cuts to a certain depth. You might have ones for 6 inches, 10 inches, 12 inches, whatever. And as it cuts down, the second you back that off, it loses contact with all of the granite. So these marks can't have been made by withdrawing that tool or it unwinding, if you like. The second it goes backwards, it would lose contact with it. So essentially, these cones or these cores are a truncated cone. It's a 3-dimensional object. It has features on it. So he was like, what's a way that we can actually lay out the features of a 3-dimensional truncated cone on a flat plane? So we thought, well, here's one way to do it. This is in the early 2000s. Let's make a latex mold of the core. And so he asked the Petrie Museum to do that. They did. They sent it to him. It sat on Chris Dunn's shelf for a couple of years, and then he got around to looking at it. And so you can see here the core, the latex mold of the core. So it has all those features. And the important thing to notice here is really these notches. So Chris, in this sort of straight line between them, he stamped these notches into it, and then you cut this latex mold along the notches. Now, all you got to remember is with these notches, I mean, they're in the same place, right? So it gives you, when you cut this, you end up with the notches on either side of the unfolded flat latex mold, but those notches join around and they're in exactly the same place. So this is the result. So this is that same latex mold laid out flat, and you can see in the insets here of this image the notch details. So you can see where he's cut the notches through the center of the notch right here at A, at B, at C, at D, and they join up. So what this lets you do is you can draw a straight line between A and B, and that's horizontal because that notch, it's the same place, right? You know it's horizontal. Same thing, C and D. So you have that horizontal reference frame of what's horizontal. So then you can look at the striations or the grooves that are cut into the stone, and you can follow them. And lo and behold, over here, it starts below A, ends at B. This black line on the bottom starts at C, it ends above D, or above F, sorry, I should say. And then same thing with this white line. So it's a geometric proof that these grooves on this latex, on this core, are in fact spiral. They're not horizontal, right? This is the key point here. And this is what, Chris Dunn said about it in his book, Lost Technologies of Ancient Egypt. Highly recommend it. But he says that my final conclusion, based on Malcolm McClure Meyer's on-site inspection, as well as the flat layout of the surface with arcs applied, is that the groove around the Petrie core is a spiral. Moreover, this spiral groove travels the full length of the core, and any discontinuities are due to the ripping out of the mica, a constituent of the granite. So he's talking about there is like these little inconsistencies in it are generally due to the different mineral composition of granite. So you have things like mica, hornblende, quartz, silica that are all different hardnesses in granite. So as it's being cut, bits and pieces like sometimes can shatter and remove out. So it's not always the smoothest thing. It's one of the reasons that makes granite such a challenging material to try and do precision work in. Obviously, this stuff, I don't think this was ever intended as precision work either. I think they were just trying to cut a hole. And in fact, one thing that Chris Dunn says about this is that makes me laugh is like Petrie's core, it's literally the least important artifact from ancient Egypt. It's quite literally a piece of trash. It's scrap. Like the Egyptians would have cut that hole, or whoever made that hole, cut it and then just throw that thing over the shoulder into the dirt. Like you don't want the core, you want the hole. But the core is what's made this controversy. But you'd think, all right, well, fair enough. It's a spiral groove. Big deal. Yeah, it seems like it makes sense. It's been confirmed. What does the mainstream say about this? Have they admitted it's a spiral groove? No, they haven't. Under no circumstances will mainstream archaeology or any of its proponents admit that this is a spiral groove on Petrie's core number 7. They will always tell you, and it's in all of these textbooks and in all of the YouTubers and the skeptic guys that like to talk about this. No. These are horizontal striations from grinding.
As you can see here, we achieved this in just a few days.
Well, this one.
That could be 4th dynasty, Dennis.
This is exactly how they tell you they made this. Is with a copper tube and a bow drill and a rock. And this is part, so this little clip is from Dennis Stocks's and Mark Lehner's, Obelisk or PBS Nova Obelisk series, where they did, and kudos to them for attempting to do some of these things. A couple of interesting things about this particular experiment. One is they had to use a power tool to start the hole. They had to use a drill to get a little indentation started so they could actually seat this copper tube and do this. Two is that, they did this for the shot, but they made a couple of poor Egyptian guys basically whip this thing back and forth for a couple of days to cut like a little core out like this. And thirdly is that they've never found a single one of these tubes. No, and there's no depictions of them doing it like this at all. Like, so as much as people ask me, I don't know, it's not answering the question, but when people say, where are the tools? You should also ask these guys, where are the tools? Like, there's no depictions of this on any scenes on the wall, and there's certainly no copper tubes like this been found. This is pure speculation. However, does this work? Yes, you can grind through granite like this. There's no question. You can use sand, you can use water and sand.
I've done it for 25 years in the field, and believe me, I've done it dry, I've done it wet, and the wet is much better.
So apparently wet sand works better, but you will grind through stone and do this. And in fact, Dennis Stocks, after writing a book about these experiments, said that, quote, horizontal striations similar to the ancient ones on rose granite were visible both in the wall of the hole and upon the core. So he pulled a core out of this, he did an experiment, said, see, it's the same. Now, there's never been any really good pictures or images of Dennis Stocks' core, and when he was asked about it by Marcus Brady, the editor or the UK editor of Nexus magazine, at a talk that he gave there, when he showed him a picture of Petrie's core number 7, Dennis Stocks just turned around and walked away. But there's certainly no, there's no images of it in comparison to it. They won't admit it's a spiral groove. And does this process produce horizontal striations? Absolutely it does. There was another experiment done in the 80s by Leonard Gorlick and John Gwinnett. They wrote a paper called An Experimental Perspective on a Scholarly Disagreement, produced in Expedition magazine of spring of 1983. And this article was purported to address the very controversy that Petrie had started with his peers, discussing about whether or not, there was a spiral groove on core number 7. Interesting thing about this article, the word spiral never appears in it, not once. Even though this is literally the core element of Petrie's discussion and allegedly the core element of this paper. All they say here, and this is written in this comparison photo between a modern Mason's core and Petrie's core number 7, it says, note the similarity of the concentric lines found on the core produced by a modern Mason's diamond tubular drill. And they took a bunch of granite and a bunch of different cutting compounds, and then they ground through it, and they took photos of it under a microscope. And I'm not sure what they were trying to prove here, but I think all they did was basically show you how very different the marks and the witness marks are from a grinding process, because this is exactly what I'd expect to see when you're grinding away at a high-speed spinning tool that's, abrasively grinding away at granite. You get these faint, fine, horizontal striations and in some cases just scratches on the stone. Same thing with this modern Mason's drill. You can see these faint and fine horizontal scratches and striations. They look very different to me than these deep grooves that you see on Petrie's core number 7. I'm not sure what they were trying to prove here. To me, it proves the opposite. They don't look anything alike, but they just tell you it looks the same. Same thing Dennis Stocks says. He just tells you it looks the same. And this sort of head-in-the-sand approach to the spiral groove on Petrie's core number 7 kind of culminated in what Chris Dunn found was produced in Ian Lawton and Chris Ogilvie-Harold's Giza the Truth, which is another textbook, in that they took a photo of Petrie's core number 7, but they tilted it. They literally tilted it to make those lines on the core look horizontal. You can see that in reference frame number A here, and this is an image from Chris Dunn's book, Lost Technologies of Ancient Egypt. He's taken another picture of the core there and provided an actual accurate reference frame, which shows you that these lines actually look like they're tilted. They're tilted to the side, spiral, as they are. But in this image, the actual photograph was tilted to make the lines look horizontal on the page. And you can see how that effect works if you take a threaded pipe end and you tilt it. Like on the left here, you can see the pipe's been tilted so that these lines look straight. But if you actually correctly position it horizontally, you can quite clearly see these are spiral threads. Now, Chris is very generous in what he says about it in this book. He says, well, it could have been a mistake. I think this is not a mistake. I think this was entirely intentional in order to avoid acknowledging that there's a spiral groove on this core. Now, I found this whole discussion fascinating. Like when I read about it and I did my own research into it, I thought this was just fascinating, that this is a debate that's been going on for 100 plus years. From Petrie till today, still people arguing about it. So what did I do? Well, I did my thing. This was an early one of the things that got me into this field in the first place. I produced a video. I spent a lot of time. This one took an absolute piece of my soul with me. And I made probably one of the earliest videos that did reasonably well for me was a documentary into the ancient Egyptian tube drills, where we discussed all of this stuff in nauseating detail. And I'm happy to say that it's had nearly 2 million views now, 40,000 likes. It's nearly 8,000 comments on this video. But, it's a form of new media. I was trying to expose this mystery and this controversy to a wider audience, or a new media audience. But lo and behold, I faced exactly the same type of pushback. Don't say spiral. And you have videos like this one that were produced by a channel called Scientists Against Myths. I got to say, I'm a fan of the thumbnail to start with. I mean, if you want to talk about an embedded strawman argument, I love the little green alien and the spaceship behind it. You've got obviously Chris Dunn and me featured there, along with Petrie's core number 7. And the title is something else, like this whole 100 years of deception. By 100 years, I presume you also mean Flinders Petrie was deceiving people.
Sheer fucking hubris.
Hubris indeed.
Shit on you!
I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. Thankfully, it hasn't had that many views, but the video aside, these guys also decided, well, we'll produce some evidence. We're going to make a little paper. And they produced a paper on academia.edu or academia.org, which isn't peer-reviewed. Anyone can do it. No problem. And they produced a little paper, and this was their evidence. So they came out and they got their hands on some high-resolution photos of Petrie's core number 7. And they cut those up into, a dozen different little slices. And they lined them all up very carefully, I'm sure. And then they proceeded to draw a bunch of blue lines on them and said, see, it's not spiral. Don't say spiral. It can't be spiral. Can't be spiral. Now, there's endless problems with this approach. If anybody watched my interview with Christopher Dunn most recently, we featured in there a clip with Eric Wilson, who's an aerospace engineer, and they were discussing this approach to essentially what you're trying to do here is, and in any of these approaches, whether it's the cotton thread test or it's the latex mold, or if it would even with 3D scanning, what you're trying to do is take the features of a three-dimensional object, in this case a truncated cone, and lay them out on a flat plane. That's certainly what's been attempted here. And there's not a manufacturing or machining place in the world that would ever use this technique in order to describe the features of a truncated cone to a customer and expect them to go with it. They were literally all of the guys, that machinists and the engineers who do this sort of stuff for a living, are just shaking their head at this, because this is fraught with error. Obviously, every time you cut this and line it up, you have the possibility to make an error. You're limited to the perspective of your camera is another problem. So if you're like let's assume the camera's in the midpoint, you have straight lines going away from you up here and down here. Those lines are going to appear to curve up and down as they go away from you. Even though this is there's not a lot of depth in these images, you still have that problem. You are limited to the perspective of your camera. There's all sorts of issues with doing this, and clearly I think this was also done with quite a bit of, let's say, predetermined outcome in mind with it, which you end up with this hodgepodge of blue lines, but it just doesn't hold water from an engineering perspective. It doesn't hold water from a scientific perspective. Credit to these guys, they're at least trying to do science. I mean, they're named sciences. I just get called names and things by the other skeptic channels, but, at least they're having a go at it. But I think, and ultimately what we're trying to do with this core, I do want to get over there and scan it at some point. I'd love to scan it, basically do the same thing that Chris Dunn did with the latex mold, just do it digitally. But again, it really falls in that category of just don't say spiral. It's like, what's the problem? Why don't we want to say spiral? This is where it gets interesting, and I promise we'll relate this back to the tube, to the vases. Well, the problem with admitting that it is indeed a spiral groove on these drill cores and on Petrie's core number 7 are the implications. And Chris Dunn, again, I'm great friends with Chris Dunn. I admire his work immensely. That's why I reference him quite a bit. He talks about the implications of this spiral groove in his book, and I'm just going to read what he says about it. He says that the most startling feature of the granite core Petrie describes is the spiral groove around the core, indicating a feed rate of 0.1 inches per revolution of the drill. In my article, I stated that this feed rate was 500 times faster than modern diamond drills, which penetrate at only 0.002 inches per revolution. The correct way to describe the feed rate would be to say that it was 500 times greater than modern diamond drills, but the rotation of the drill would not have been as fast as the modern drill's 900 RPM. So what he's saying here is that the penetration rate into the granite, that 1 in 60 rate, that the rate indicated by the spiral groove on core number 7, indicates a rate of penetration into the stone 500 times greater than what we can achieve with like a modern diamond-tipped drill, which is startling. Quite a claim and quite a revelation, particularly when you consider what I'd mentioned before about the tapering of the hole. That's why it's important that groove wasn't created when the tool was withdrawn. It's the mark of the machine that created it. It's a witness mark, and that tool was very powerful. Now, that tool probably wasn't moving super high speed. We don't know how fast it was moving, but it probably wasn't spinning like our modern grinding tools spin. And, you know, Chris, in his typical kind of understated way, talks about this a little bit in what he says, in that the action of a tool that reflected a feed rate of 0.1 inches per revolution of the drill was not the work of conventional drilling as we know it, and demanded consideration of other processes in its creation. All of the features were considered phenomenal, not just by me alone, but also by colleagues with whom I discussed their relevance. So these are like machinists, engineers, people that are looking at this and are just going, what is this? Like this is, I mean, we're so far away. Same thing with the precision on the vessels. You know, this is what I like about this discussion, is that we are so far away from this silly idea that butt flap wearing primitives were grinding on these things with rocks and sand and sticks. Like, we can argue all day about what actually created it or how it was created. Same thing with the precision on the vases, but we're already at a point where we can take this idea of the capabilities of the people who made this, our current idea of it, and just throw it out the window, I think. I think all of this is absolute grounds for a reevaluation of big parts of our history. Now, again, let's go back to the vessels and the vases, because why is this important? Well, because this technology was used to shape the vessels. Okay? And this technology is pre-dynastic. Here's a hardstone vessel in the Petrie Museum from the Nakata culture. That's a pre-dynastic culture before the First Dynasty. Here's a basalt drill core from a vase, also at the Petrie Museum. We know this is actually a drill core from a vase. These vessels that use this technology, along with being precise, are unquestionably pre-dynastic. They come to us from sites that have been dated as far back as 14,500 years at a place called Toshka. I get all sorts of crap for mentioning Toshka. I use it as an outlier of an example of a pre-dynastic sites. This is a picture of it. You can quite clearly see there are vessels laying around all over the place. Here's an image of a burial here. These look like stone vessels to me, some of them might be pottery. But regardless of whether you like the example of Toshka or not, they are unquestionably pre-dynastic. There are thousands of examples from cultures that well and truly predate the dynastic Egyptians. That is not controversial at all. Here's some more examples from areas like Toshka. This is another same thing, this fetal primitive burial in a shallow grave. If you take a close-up look at this one up top here, this absolutely looks like stone to me. This image, to zoom in of this image here. And then something else interesting is happening even in these very ancient pre-dynastic burials. We have imitation going on. This is a pottery vessel. You see the spirals on it. This is like very much like, if not the example here of a vessel that I found at where is this, in the Nubian Museum in Aswan. And in fact, a lot of these sites today, like Toshka, they're all underwater now. They're in Upper Egypt. They're in what's now flooded the Lake Nasser, which was created when the Egyptians built the dam in the 1960s. And this is clear imitation of hard stone vessels. In fact, these museums tell you so. They say that in the Egyptian Museum, the London Museum. Vessels laboriously carved from hard stone were very expensive and held oils and ornaments that were probably even more valuable. I don't know about that. An imitation could magically supply both the container and its contents for the afterlife. Here, the pot's spiral decoration mimics the limestone breccia of the jar. So in a pre-dynastic burial, you already have pots where they are trying to make the pottery look like hard stone vessels. How did they get the idea for hard stone vessels like this? How did they do it? Probably because they found them, and they already had them, and they were being buried with them in these sites that go back as far as nearly 15,000 years ago. Who knows how much further? We just don't know. They were found in the Naqada culture, Naqada 1, Naqada 2. These are the precursors to the dynastic Egyptians. You're talking like 7,000 BC, that region. These are vessels that were found in these burials. This is absolutely a stone vessel found in one of these burials. Some of these look like stone vessels to me. Same sort of burial, primitive, fetal position, shallow grave. Literally no other examples of hard stone working in any form. It's one of the craziest things to me, and it comes to like shots like this. And you find this in the museum at Cairo in the Naqada culture section, a pre-dynastic section. You have a hard stone vessel, and you have what is clearly imitation next to it. Pottery, hand-spun, not made on a wheel, painted to look like granite. Everything else you find from these cultures, from these times, it's bone, it's beads, very primitive. It's a big problem for even antique dealers to explain when they look at vessels that come from the 1st and 2nd dynasty, because they have to admit that there's literally no other stonework being done like this at that time. There's no statuary, there's no architecture. That all starts in the 3rd dynasty. The statues, the architecture, the big stonework. But these vessels, they predate all of that. They go back way back further. Which begs the question, do you think those pre-dynastic people made these vessels? There's no indication that they did. We don't know how old they are. But they are small enough that they can be buried. They're not giant architecture. They're not giant boxes and statues. Remember that point. These vessels, we know they're old and they're pre-dynastic, and that's because they could be buried with these people who had them. Probably didn't make them. Didn't have, certainly no indication they had the capability to make them, but they were buried with them. You can't do that with the statues and the architecture and the boxes and the columns and the obelisks. I think that's a really important connection here. So just as an aside, and something that I think is quite funny, you notice the pattern that's been put on this vase here. It's this dotted, painted imitation granite. It's pottery meant to look like granite. That imitation is being done today in exactly the same way that it was being done in pre-dynastic times, and it's being done on the statues. So as they're renovating these sites and recreating this original flawless granite with concrete, they're painting the concrete to make it look like granite in exactly the same way. We're doing the exact same thing. This is a statue that's been put back together at Luxor, and you can see the neck where it's all concrete. They've joined the pieces together. They've just dotted it up to make it look like granite. It's exactly the same thing, just happening in modern times. We haven't changed much, apparently. Can't really recreate the original, so might as well fake it till you make it, I guess. So these vessels, again, we know most of them, however, were found beneath the Step Pyramid, 40,000 plus of them. Jean-Philippe Loyer found them down there. Interestingly, Loyer took over excavation of the Step Pyramid in the 1920s. He documented the 40,000 to 50,000 of them. That place was being excavated for decades before him. We don't really know what was removed from there in those time periods, but Loyer found, at least 40 to 50,000 of them. They're explained in the timeline as heirlooms from an earlier time. They have to admit that many of these come from earlier periods, like the 1st and 2nd dynasty, because they have some hieroglyphs that are very poorly carved on them that show the names of people from rulers from the 1st and 2nd dynasty. And they're admitting here at the Imhotep Museum that these were actually inherited heirlooms. Again, this is a I think this is a fundamental concept when it comes to looking at the mysteries of ancient Egypt, this idea of inheritance. They're just not going back far enough. They say, oh, well, you know, the building of these vessels reached the peak in the first two dynasties. And then, you know, it all just changed to alabaster after that because Imhotep came along and just figured out a new method of making vessels. Apparently and I think exactly what was happening was Imhotep, being a genius, found out a way to imitate these hardstone vessels with alabaster, because the alabaster ones aren't as precise, they're not as well balanced, they're not as difficult. But, you know, I think he was just the genius that came along that figured out how he could get as close a thing to it, and the whole industry of vase making and vessel making shifted to alabaster pretty much after that point, with a few exceptions of things that were recovered and renamed later on. So again, why the resistance to these ideas? Why the resistance to the idea that there's a spiral groove on these cores and that there's significant technology? Well, I think it's the connections that you can then draw, you have to draw between the different artifacts and the different bits of technology that make them. We find tubular drills in the vases. We know they're part of the vase construction. They go way back in time. The use of them go back to these pre-dynastic times with the hardstone vessels. These tubular drills are also very prevalent on Old Kingdom sites, like Abu Sir, Giza, places like that. They go back as far back as the dynastic Egyptian civilization does. We also find tubular drills in architecture and, you know, on artifacts. And the other aspect that's probably less well known is that tubular drills are also tightly coupled to the pyramid builders. They're also coupled to the pyramids. And you might be thinking, what are you talking about? Like, I've not heard about tube drills on the pyramids. Well, turns out, and particularly on the Great Pyramid, there are lots of tube drills all over it. It's very much a part of the features of the Great Pyramid. And I want to run you through some examples of those, and we'll start here, which is at the main entrance. You can't get up here anymore. You can obviously see those chevron blocks up there, and it's behind these blocks that they found that little hidden chamber, that small chamber that was discovered, I think, or announced last year. But right up here, you used to be able to get up here. I think in the 2010s, you could come up here. It was public access. You could get up there, no problem. Now it's all off limits. You can't get up there. I had to go up here at nighttime on one of the private visits. And, you know, it's a nighttime shot that you can get up here. You know, there are stairways. It's no big deal getting up here, but I wanted to take a look up here because I knew there was something up here that I'd heard about I wanted to check out. And that is at the main entrance. So you can see here, looking down at what is the main entrance. This is the descending passage that runs all the way down to the subterranean chamber. Normally when you enter the Great Pyramid, you do so through Mumwood's Hole, which is down from here, and it takes you right to the intersection of this descending passage where it meets the ascending passage that goes up to the Grand Gallery and the King's Chamber. But if you look closely at this image, you might see something interesting here in the bottom left. This is a stone that isn't like the other stones. It's a granite block. It's not all limestone here. There is a granite block here, and inside this granite block, which is broken at one end, there are 3 amazing large tubular drills. Here's a closer look at that granite block. You can see 1, 2, 3 tubular drills. This one's open from where the block's been split. And if you look on the inside of this tubular drill, you see the same thing that we see on Petrie's core number 7. Deep grooves, probably spiral. I don't know. I'd love to see this thing get scanned or analyzed, or a latex mold made of it or something like that. But yeah, obviously tubular drills. Now this is up at the main entrance. And these things are functional tools. They're not just decorative. This was probably part of some mechanism that might have functioned at the main entrance at some point. Who knows what? We don't know how big this block was. We don't know if there was a block on the other side like it. All that's missing. But for sure, tubular drills are found here on the outside of the Great Pyramid. We also find tube drills inside the Great Pyramid. In fact, down at the other end of this passage, from where that doorway connects to, down here in the subterranean chamber, at the bottom or in the middle of that chamber, there's a massive big pit. And then halfway down that pit, there's a big granite block. And on that granite block, we find tubular drills. This block has probably came from the main entrance. It was probably kicked down that shaft, eventually ended up in the subterranean chamber, and then somebody shoved it into this hole, into this pit at some point, and it's resting on this ledge down here. And if you look closely at this block, you get down there and you take a look at it, you can see at least 2 tubular drills that have been made into it, and you get the light just right, you can see exactly it's the same thing. We see deep grooves and indentations, and these are complete holes. This would be fantastic opportunity for photogrammetry or a latex molding to be made of these and to analyze the witness marks left in the stone, but of course no one's really interested in doing that. But this is a big granite block that's down there in that chamber with tubular drills in it. There's more. There's also a granite block that's located in the grotto. The grotto is this small chamber that's about at ground level inside the pyramid. It is in the middle of what's called the well shaft, which is a near vertical shaft that runs from the bottom of the grand gallery down through the masonry to ground level. The grotto hits here, and then this shaft continues all the way down and intersects near the bottom of the descending passageway down in the bedrock. Now, in this chamber, it's very difficult to visit. In this chamber, it's been documented over hundreds of years now that there is a granite block, and this granite block originally probably came from the antechamber or from the king's chamber, and it was kicked down the grand gallery, and then it was shoved into this hole into the well shaft, and in fact it was stuck in the well shaft. It's a granite block. I think it's about 600 pounds is the estimate, and it was actually wedged in that shaft, in that well shaft, for quite some time, until then it was dislodged and it fell down and ended up in the grotto. And then it's been documented in the grotto, and it has tubular drills in it. I can't find any photos of it. The people that I know who have been in here in recent times says that this block is pretty much buried in debris at this point, because this chamber is very slowly moving upwards. The ceiling's coming down and it's filling up at the bottom, so it's kind of like a void that's moving upwards, and it's slowly burying this granite block. But there's tube drills in this granite block in the grotto. We also find tube drills in the king's chamber. We find them on the inside walls of the box in here. There's a precision granite box. It's the famous granite box in the king's chamber. It's been blown apart, but if you get the light just right and you look around on the inside of this box, you can see the marks from a tube drill that ran astray. So you get your torch down the bottom and you look down on it. You'll find in two spots there was a tube drill that actually ran off course, and it dug into the wall a little bit. And this should tell you something else, in that this was clearly a powerful tool. It had to run off course a little bit to actually make that mistake. Otherwise, you'd be there for days.
As you can see here, we achieved this in just a few days.
It'd take you a very long time to make that mistake by hand. You'd have to be making the mistake for days on end in order to run off course like that. But you see these little overcuts in places like this, and this is another indication of just how powerful these tools were. So tubular drills are all over the pyramid. We see them all over these sites, and I am happy to say that there's been some progress made in the last couple of years in terms of documenting them. I've been working and getting some help with people that are very skilled at photogrammetry, and I've got some very good high-resolution scans assembled from photogrammetry of tubular drill holes from around the different sites, and I'm hoping to get to a point where I can do exactly what Chris Dunn did with the latex mold, and that is to lay this out flat and then analyze the geometry of these grooves that are on the inside of the hole, so we can answer the question about whether or not these are spiral also. So that's stuff yet to happen. Hopefully it will. So when it comes to these sort of overcuts and these indications of tubular drills and other powerful tools, we see those on larger artifacts as well. We see them in statues. Many of these old kingdom statues, you can see marks for tubular drills between the feet. You can see overcuts into granite and diorite at the seat, for example. Again, this is not something that happens in any handwork. These are obviously powerful tools that have been taken to this stone, and they've left little overcuts in them. You see them in the armpits if you look closely. Again, these statues are Old Kingdom statues, just flawless statues, but if you look closely in these areas, there was quite clearly a powerful tool that was run in here to make some initial cuts, and it's left some overcuts. You see these overcuts in the armpits. This is between the feet of another statue. Very clearly the indication of a tubular drill has been used in its construction. And then we see more overcuts on even larger artifacts like obelisks. These are overcuts from circular saws that were made into obelisks, granite obelisks at Karnak. You can even see how the cut had been sort of straightened out here. There was again another mistake made, and it ran off course, and then it was straightened out again. You can also see where the cuts begin and end, which tells you that it was indeed a circular saw that made them. You can't make these sort of cuts with a straight blade. Now, these larger artifacts with these tool marks and this precision and things like that, interesting thing about them is they can't really be buried with you like the vases can, right? This is the real difference between the vases and the larger artifacts in that they're larger. They can't be buried, but they can be inherited. They can be inherited, and they certainly were. We know this. We know about these things were written on later. I've got a whole diatribe about this in a number of videos and presentations. For example, you can see this hieroglyph was cut in over the top of pre-existing features. One of my favorite examples is this just chicken scratch nonsense writing that is on the perfection of the boxes in the Serapeum, and it's always the writing that kind of dates and relates these artifacts into the story of history. Ramses puts his name on them, therefore Ramses had it made. That's the way the logic works. I think it's nonsense. I think these things were inherited, and the possibility exists that they're actually far older. The idea that these were inherited leads to something of a broader concept, and that is one of cultural inheritance. It's a question I often get asked is like, well, if you think that some of these statues are so old, how come they look like dynastic Egyptians? I actually think it's the other way around. You can imagine that the dynastic Egyptians themselves, I mean, they are connected to this builder culture. They themselves have a history, as we'll look at in a little bit later, that goes back tens of thousands of years, as they write it, to Zep Tepi, to the time of the gods. They connect themselves to these advanced cultures that predated them. But if you were an emerging Bronze Age culture that is, gathering together from all these tribes and this, in this desert area in the Nile Valley, and you found statues like the ones that we've discussed, like this one, these 1,000-ton monoliths with these icons. I mean, these would be your gods. You would absolutely model yourself after them. So I think it's possible that not only did the dynastic Egyptians inherit artifacts, things like vessels and vases and boxes, statues and obelisks, even sites, I think they've also inherited some of their culture and their iconography. And you can see this as evidenced by pretty much from the Old Kingdom to the Ptolemaic times, the depictions of pharaohs and rulers in Egypt, the iconography doesn't change. They're always trying to look like one of the gods. And I think they get that idea potentially from some of these statues and these indications. I mean, if you saw a 1,000-ton statue staring out at you in the desert, I mean, that would be a god. And over enough time, with enough hubris and arrogance and, endless generations of kings that grow in power, you end up with guys like Ramses who just will go, you know what, write my name on it. That's me. That's going to be mine. I'm going into the afterlife with that. I want to be remembered as a god, as one of the gods. So put my name on that. I think that's I really think that's a legitimate explanation for a lot of what we see here. Inheritance played a massive role, but it wasn't just inheritance of just objects and artifacts. It was also iconography and culture, because I don't think the dynastic Egyptians have the capabilities of a precursor culture, but I think they have memories of it, and that they took these things and they tried to recreate them symbolically and through ritual, but they just didn't have the technology to do it. But they had cultural memory of it, and I think that helps to explain some of it. I actually think this idea of inheritance also plays a part on the sites themselves. So I think the sites themselves were also inherited, and in a lot of cases fully rebuilt. Places like Karnak, I mean, this is all dynastic work that you're seeing right now. This is absolutely spectacular. I mean, don't underestimate the dynastic Egyptians. Phenomenal work made from sandstone, just awe-inspiring when you go in there. But a close look at some of these sites will reveal that, in fact, they are a little bit different in the core and in the central areas of them. They all have these granite cores to them that typically show you these artifacts that have this sophisticated technology and machining marks. I mean, look at the size of the granite blocks that make up this alcove at the core of Karnak. This is exactly the same sort of architecture you'd see at the Valley Temple, at the Sphinx Temple. It's the same as what they term Old Kingdom. They thought this was an offering table for the longest time, until they figured out it's actually a box. It's a box with a lid. You also, on these sites, these New Kingdom sites, they always tell you the New Kingdom, Karnak, Luxor, they have the names of Old Kingdom rulers on them. So we know something was here. We know there were aspects of this site that were here in the earliest periods of the dynastic Egyptian civilization. It wasn't until the later times in places like the Middle and New Kingdom that they were rebuilt and renamed and rededicated to guys like Ramses of the 19th dynasty in the New Kingdom. In fact, in some areas on these sites, like at Karnak, you can find evidence for these older layers, not just the granite cores, but actually older layers beneath the stonework that's there today. In the great hyperstyle hall with all of its sandstone columns and pylons, where they've removed some floor tiles down a foot or two, what do we find? White calcite column bases from older sets of columns. Same over here with a granite column base. Other white calcite column bases that are out of sync and not remotely used or part of the modern, or the New Kingdom column work that's on these sites. These sites were rebuilt, and they were rebuilt on top of older layers. And these older layers show more sophisticated stonework in harder stone, in more difficult stone, in rarer stone. And I think that granite core was part of that same older layer that the rest of the site has been built up around. We also see evidence for older timelines on the Giza Plateau itself. Now, this site, as most of the Old Kingdom sites are a little bit different to the later New Kingdom temples that you see in Upper Egypt, in that these are considered to be Old Kingdom. Everything on these pyramid sites is thought to have been made in the 3rd, 4th, 5th dynasty, that type of time frame. But if you look closely at some of the architecture that you can find at Giza, there is what I think is some clear evidence for longer timelines and indeed inheritance, renovation, and reuse, like we see on the other temples. Now, at this particular image, we're standing in the Western Cemetery, which is behind, if you like, to the west of the Great Pyramid, looking towards the Middle Pyramid. You can see the peak of the Khafra Pyramid pointing up above this stone structure in front of us. And we're at the same height, the same elevation level as the megalithic temple or pyramid temple of the Middle Pyramid complex. And it's kind of, if anyone's seen my recent video about some of these features on the Giza Plateau, you'll probably know the answer to this question. But, which of these two images looks older to you? Well, if you guessed the one on the left looks older, you'd be incorrect. According to the Orthodox timeline, it's in fact the structure on the right that's supposedly older. The structure on the right is part of the Western Cemetery of Khufu, the supposed builder of the Great Pyramid. The structure on the left is part of that pyramid temple of the Middle Pyramid complex that is attributed to Khafra, who is Khufu's son. So technically, this structure on the right is thought to be older than the structure on the left. Obviously, that doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, given that these are at the same elevation level. They're made from exactly the same type of stone, the nummulitic limestone that is found on the Giza Plateau. In fact, a lot of it was quarried from the plateau itself, although not exclusively at Giza. And even there's the structure on the left, the heavily eroded structure, was also cased in granite, as is the Valley Temple, the Sphinx Temple, so was the Mortuary Temple at the pyramid. It was cased in massive blocks of megalithic granite that presumably protected it from erosion and effects like these for thousands of years. But the structure on the right, made from the same stone, was never cased in granite, and it looks just fine. It's only got the barest traces of erosion on it. It's very difficult to reconcile how you can say these things are roughly the same age, built by the same people, even though they are built of the same stone at the same elevation level. Similarly, if you look at the Valley Temple and some of the higher levels of the Valley Temple, parts of it that weren't buried in sand and, thus protected from erosion, a lot of the Valley Temple has its granite casing blocks still in place. But if you look up high, you can see what were the original sort of higher levels. There was a second level on that Valley Temple structure. You can see these massive megalithic core masonry limestone blocks are also very heavily eroded. If you look at between the Mortuary Temple and the Valley Temple, in some places up to 2 feet, probably even more, of erosion has taken place on this limestone. Yet, just to the east of the Great Causeway that runs between that Mortuary Temple and the Valley Temple, again, all 4th dynasty structures, that's this image on the left. It's also made from limestone, supposedly also made in the same time period by the same people as the structure on the left, the Valley Temple. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, the obvious difference between them is the construction style. Even though they're made of the same type of stone, there's a clear difference in construction style in terms of one is megalithic, it has massive big blocks in its construction. The other is not. It's some of these smaller block constructions that are still in good condition. They're fine work. It's incredibly well done work. It's still standing the test of time. No doubt it's thousands of years old, but it doesn't look anything like as eroded as the older structures. And as I said, there's a clear difference in construction style. Similar to the Tale of Two Industries. It seems like there are two different things going on here, but it's all attributed to the same time period, to the same people, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Now, when you look at the erosion on these blocks, the real key question, whether or not whatever you think caused the erosion, the real question is, why don't we see the same level of erosion on the that we do on the megalithic work on the smaller blocked dynastic work? It's the question that I never hear people address. I hear a lot of talk about what might have caused the erosion. Is it rainfall? Is it wind and sand? Is it natural weathering? Is it some sort of chemical process? All these types of questions, and the jury's out on that. Who really knows what exactly caused this severe erosion that we can see on the limestone of these megalithic structures? The question I think we should be pondering along with that is, how come we don't see the same level of erosion on the other structures that are made from smaller blocks of stone? It's exactly the same stone, supposedly made at exactly the same time. It's in many cases at the same elevation level, and a lot of the heavily eroded stuff, most of it, the megalithic work, was also cased in protective granite. But considering the erosion, again, people who watch the recent video on erosion will know this, but there's been many studies that have been done in terms of how long it takes to erode limestone. We don't have to rely on just guesswork here. Over the last couple of hundred years, really, there's been a lot of studies into just how long does it take to erode limestone. So in high energy environments, now we're talking, intertidal zones, coastal zones where you've got seawater action hitting limestone 24/7. Or limestone blocks that are in rivers where you've just got flowing water running over it all the time, very high energy erosive environments. The studies that have been done would say that in order to erode 2 feet of limestone, which is roughly 610 millimeters, it would take between 610 and 1200 years to erode 2 feet of limestone in one of those very high energy erosive environments. Now, if you look at more typical weathering patterns, more normal weathering, which is, wind, rain, those types of things, which is what we see occurring around most of the places. And certainly that's been the effect that we see, at least as long as we've known about it at the Giza Plateau. It takes much, much longer. There are ways to date and measure limestone erosion found all around the world, very conveniently, in fact, in places like cemeteries, where you have a limestone headstone of a tomb, and it's been dated when it was cut. The people, you put the date on it, or you make a monument, something gets carved in stone, and it gets dated. So you're able to come back over time and measure things like how long it takes for the face of that stone to recede and erode, and you can measure erosional rates. The US Department of Standards at one point put limestone cubes up on the roof of their building in Washington, D.C., and over a period of, I think, about 10 or 11 years, were measuring erosion due to just weathering on that building. So all of these studies that have been done, and these are typically in places with 40 plus inches of rainfall a year, which is, a much more high energy form of erosion relative to just normal weathering, wind, that type of thing. There's varying results have come back for the different types of limestone, but the results are well and truly beyond the timescales that we know of for the dynastic Egyptian civilization. So in order to erode 2 feet of limestone in just normal conditions, you're talking anywhere from 12,000 years to 61,000 years to 80,000 years to even 122,000 years to erode 2 feet of limestone. And we see that degree of erosion at the Giza Plateau. Of course, it's worth mentioning that the rainfall at the Giza Plateau is nothing like 40 inches a year. It's something like 1 inch or less, if it even rains at all during a year. I will say that I've seen it rain in Giza pretty hard a couple of times during my visits to Egypt, but it's a rare event. You certainly don't get 40 inches of rainfall a year. As I mentioned, I have looked into this erosion in some depth in a recent video. Go and check that out. It'll be linked below if you want to dive into the details of the erosion that we see on the Giza Plateau and the differences between the megalithic erosion and what we see on less megalithic or smaller block structures that are all attributed to the same time period. Another indication of what I think could be much longer timeframes on the Giza Plateau and indeed at the pyramid sites themselves in Lower Egypt is the location of what you might call ancient waterways. So I don't think it's a controversial statement to suggest that the Valley Temple may once have been a harbor. It's typically what it's called when you're out the front of the Valley Temple. Like you can see here, this area in front of it is often described as a harbor. And it supposedly was where boats would come in with loads of stone during the inundation on, the 3-month inundation period on the Nile, which I assume would be something that didn't happen quite every year. Occasionally the water would get up here and maybe it's suitable for docking boats for a small period of time during the year. In fact, there are some historical photographs of what it looks like when it does flood near the Giza Plateau, and this is all prior to the 1960s when the Aswan Dam was built, which ended the annual inundation of the Nile. And as you can see, there's not a whole lot of water that gets really up to this point. You would think that maybe if you were looking to build a massive megalithic harbor that is the source for all of your stone for building projects, you might take the trouble of building it perhaps a little closer to the river during that time. But that's not what we see, particularly when we say that, this was built by the dynastic Egyptians around 27 or 2600 BC in order to receive stone. I think there's been some interesting discoveries made in recent times that put a different spin on this. In fact, there's a whole, and this is showing you the Wall of the Crow, which is nearby to the Valley Temple. It's another big megalithic structure. To me, it seems like it's probably had something or did have something to do with controlling the flow of water. Seems like a hydrological control device, potentially. It's at about the same elevation level as the Valley Temple. Most people can't get over to see this. It's a whole separate ticket. You've got to go off to the side of the pyramids to check this out. But it's a really interesting structure. And to me, it seems like, okay, this might have had something to do with an ancient waterway when it existed. Now, there's been some recent scientific discoveries made only this year, I think earlier, around May of 2024, that suggests potentially there was something else going on here. This new study that came out suggests that the Egyptian pyramid chains are not just the Giza Plateau itself, but also Abbassiya, Saqqara, Dashur, all of these other sites that run down towards the south, were built on the banks of what is now an extinct and abandoned branch of the Nile River called the Aramat branch. And it's interesting when you look at this Aramat branch when it existed. So this is something that the study itself says. Based on the interpretation of archaeological material and pollen records, this period, known as the African Humid period, from 14,500 to 5,000 years ago, was the most significant and persistent wet period from the early to mid-Holocene in the eastern Sahara Desert, with an annual rainfall rate of 300 to 920 millimeters per year. During this time, the Nile would have had several secondary channels branching out across the floodplain. So what it's saying is that during this period, this is the rainy period that people often describe, that I think Robert Schoch described when he talked about what might have caused the erosion on the Sphinx. This was a much more humid period for Egypt. And in fact, the Sahara Desert was not a desert during this time at all. It was a savanna. It would have had grasslands and vegetation, would have had river systems, lake basins, that type of thing, and enough rainfall and water coming down into that floodplain of the Nile Valley that supported the existence of multiple secondary channels or branches of the Nile, one of those being the Aramat. And in places, this study found that this Aramat branch was 500 meters, even a kilometer wide in places, and that these pyramids and sites like the Valley Temple of the Giza Plateau were built up right against it, which seems to make, to me, a lot more sense if you were going to build a harbor. You'd probably build it up against the water where you could get boats in and out whenever you needed them to. The interesting thing is that the African Humid period actually ended hundreds of years before the start of the Egyptian civilization ever happened. Certainly before the 4th dynasty, when they say this was supposed to have been built. And this is alluded to in this paper here with this quote. With the ending of the African humid period and the beginning of the late Holocene around 5,500 years ago to present, rainfall greatly declined and the region's humid phase gradually came to an end. So when you talk about 5,500 years ago, that's 3,500 BC. They say that the orthodox dating for the pyramids and a lot of the 4th dynasty work at Giza is roughly 2,700, 2,600 BC. So it's, a little under 1,000 years, a full millennium after that African humid period ended, and that Aramat branch would have dried up when supposedly they built the Valley Temple and the other megalithic structures. Seems like it would have made a lot more sense to build those as a harbour on the actual branch of the Nile that existed in earlier times. I would also like to say that I don't think it's set in stone about when this period began. The paper says that this was something like 14,500 years ago when this African humid period began, but I'm not sure exactly what's behind that. I don't think we really know how long that went for in terms of time, into deep history, like how long the Sahara Desert was in fact a savanna with river systems, lake basins, and the like. So where does all this evidence lead? When we look at the evidence for machining, precision, logistics, inheritance, the tale of two industries, I think it leads to some interesting places and interesting conclusions. And I know I've been rattling on for a long time here, so we're going to try and wrap this up. The ancient pre-dynastic sophisticated hardstone vessels were machined precisely. We know that. There's evidence for it. They've been analysed. They share a technological link to other larger stone artifacts and architecture through machining witness marks and precision. We see the overcuts, we see the tubular drill marks, we see the same machining marks and precision that we see on the vases on many other artifacts and indeed architecture. Many of these artifacts and sites have long histories and they have a lot of evidence for inheritance, renovation and reuse. The sites themselves get inherited, they get rebuilt. A lot of these artifacts, people write their names on them. They go through successive generations. You can't be buried with these huge statues or boxes, so they get inherited. And eventually, there's someone with enough hubris and arrogance that they're going to write their name on them. And that naming and whatever gets written on them is typically how those things are dated and related into the story of history. We also know that the tools in the archaeological record and the depictions and scenes on walls can't explain these artifacts, but they do explain other artifacts and other objects. We see that in the Tale of Two Industries. We also find extensive erosion on megalithic work, particularly on the Giza Plateau, also in places like Saqqara, as well as hydrological features that match older timelines that had different climates. They seem much more suited to a wetter climate when there would have been a river system up near the Giza Plateau, much closer to the harbour of the Valley Temple. And certainly the erosion to me is a massive question mark around just how long have these megalithic structures been here. So is there any other evidence? Is there written evidence on the Giza Plateau that supports these ideas? And in fact, there is. I've looked at this in a video many years ago now, but there's a very small rock-cut chamber or tomb. It was, I think, not ever originally a tomb, but it was certainly repurposed as a tomb. It's called the Tomb of Kwa, or Ka, I have no idea how to pronounce that. And it's found out in front to the, I think, the east of the Great Pyramid near the boat pit. And you can get down in here. I have a video looking at it. It's a resonance chamber. It has a lot of resonance properties. But there's some interesting hieroglyphs that were written here in the Old Kingdom in the 4th dynasty. And I've taken a screenshot from this video here that is my friend Yusuf and Muhammad describing some of the words here. And what he's saying is that the name of the place is Upet Met, and these symbols mean the overseer of the pyramid city. So this was the tomb for the overseer of the pyramid city. And that's an interesting term to use, isn't it? Pyramid city. This is something that Muhammad points out in this video, but it's like, imagine building a hotel near the Giza Plateau today and you called it the Pyramid Gardens Inn or something like that. Because you've called it the Pyramid Gardens, does that mean that you are the people who built the pyramid? They're not saying that they were the overseer of the pyramids or of the pyramid project. This is the overseer of the pyramid city, the city that was built at the pyramids. And again, this is 4th dynasty. This is supposedly at the same time the pyramids were built, according to the Orthodox timeline, but they're not claiming that. They're claiming that this was the overseer for the pyramid city, not the pyramids themselves. And in fact, another term in here is quite interesting. And this is what Yusuf says in the video. It says, as it happens, this word right here, kenti-ish, and this is one word from 4 symbols, and it means settler. It doesn't mean builder or anything like that. It means settler. People came here to settle because I think the pyramids, or parts of them, were evidently in place. Further than that, again, I've looked at this in previous videos as well, but if you take a look at one of the other areas, I think this is over near the causeway, I think to the east of the Great Causeway, but there's a small area in here that is the tomb of Ra-Wer, who was a priest for a 5th dynasty pharaoh. And in it, you can find things that are called his offering tables. And these are, the archaeologists who discovered this said these are quite odd for offering tables, in that then typically offering tables are square. But in this case, he said, well, these are round and they're made from white calcite. And this is showing you one of his offering tables right here. It's a big round platform made from white calcite that's been cut roughly. Here's another one. There's 2 of them in his offering hall. And if you've been paying attention to some of, I guess, my work and some of the slides earlier, you might know what these are, in fact, or what they were originally. And that is that these are white calcite column bases. In a lot of places and a lot of these ancient sites, you will find white calcite column bases, and evidently there were white calcite column bases somewhere around Giza that in the 5th dynasty were repurposed and reused as offering tables. In the case of this one, the front was actually cut off, this was flattened, and then his depiction and some hieroglyphs were drawn around it. But originally, these were column bases. They were never intended or made to be offering tables, but they were repurposed in the Old Kingdom from older structures to become offering tables. In fact, one of these offering tables, this one over here, it even has still a calcite buildup of a ring around it where the column was sitting on it, and it must have been sitting there for such a long time that you have that limestone or calcite buildup around the edges of where that column was sitting and you know, just resting on this column base. Clearly it was a column base and it was repurposed in later time periods. We also see this at the satellite pyramids on the Great Pyramid. So around the Great Pyramid, there are several smaller pyramids. They're known as the pyramids of the queens. Some say that this is the pyramid of Khufu's daughter. And we're looking at the edge of one of them here, the casing stones. And this was an unfinished job. And you can see these casing stones. This is the edge of the pyramid. And they were never finished smoothing off these casing stones and cutting them down. But if I back this film up here a little bit, you'll see something really interesting, is that this casing stone, it's not a rough block that's come from a quarry. This is a finished surface. There are these protrusions on it right here. I'm going to pause it. There are protrusions on it. This is a smooth, polished, finished surface. So wherever this stone was taken from, it was taken from a pre-existing monument, a pre-existing structure that was finished, and it was repurposed as a casing stone on a supposedly 4th dynasty pyramid structure. You can even still see the mason's marks. So whoever, when they were shaping this and they were looking to carve off parts of the faces and flatten these down, you can still see the mason's marks on the stone. It's quite remarkable. It's something I only noticed in recent visits to the Giza Plateau. And you can quite clearly see how this process has taken place. If you look at some of these other blocks, you can see there's still finished ones here. And these are ones where they've been hammering this down. And you can just see the rough chiseling marks where this was being done by the dynastic Egyptians in order to face these down and cut them back and make them flat casing stones. And this was a job that, for whatever reason, never got finished. But it seems clear to me that these blocks were coming from another structure that was already finished. We're talking about the Old Kingdom here, the very earliest parts of the dynastic Egyptian civilization. What was around before that in the Orthodox timeline? There really wasn't anything, certainly no megalithic structures. The big, massive stonework, objects that would use blocks like these, really didn't start until the 3rd dynasty. There's nothing in the 1st or 2nd dynasty that is attributed like this, but clearly there was something here that all gets attributed to the 4th dynasty later on, but it's being taken from what were evidently older structures. Also, we can take a look at what the Egyptians themselves say, and I've told you this story, or I've talked about this ad nauseum, as have many other people, but you know, there are several sources, the Egyptian priest Maneo, the Turin Papyrus, a couple of others that talk about the Egyptians' own history, what they talk about as being their own lineage, their own history. The best source for this is the Turin Papyrus, but the Egyptians themselves thought of themselves as a legacy civilization. They thought they were connected to their ancestors who were around during these ancient times where, mystical, the magical kind of incredible beings walked the earth and that they achieved remarkable feats. This is broken up into 2 time periods, one called Zep-Tepi, or when the gods or the Neteru themselves walked the earth. And they have a list of kings who reigned for some 23,200 years, and it's all named out. This is followed by the period known as the Shemsu-Hor period, or the followers of Horus, who were also these semi-divine mystical kings who also reigned for some 13,420 years, the total list of them, and it totals up more than 36,000 years. And after that, you get Minu, the first pharaoh of the first dynasty of the ancient Egyptian civilization as we know it, and it runs right through up until Cleopatra, when she died, and it effectively ended the ancient Egyptian civilization. Now, it's only in our times, and it's our archaeologists and Egyptologists who somewhat arbitrarily decide that, well, this stuff is all just myth and legend, and the real history really only starts with, Menes, the first king of the first dynasty, and that's where history begins and myth and legend ends. But the Egyptians themselves made no such distinction. So when you put all this together, I think it's interesting to consider where the opportunities are in the future. There are many, I think, opportunities, particularly in the realm of scanning more artifacts, learning more about them, using technology, using some of the tools and techniques that have been developed in recent years. But if we go with this hypothesis that there was a precursor advanced civilization, if they existed, and if it existed, it did so during an entirely different climatic period in this area, and there was a lot more livable land. Like, I think if there was a precursor civilization, it most likely existed when the Sahara Desert wasn't a desert, but it was more likely a savanna. Once that savanna period ended, however, and this, remember, this was also hundreds of years before the dynastic Egyptian civilization ever began, the Sahara would have been a desert. So the only place for a civilization to begin is in the Nile Valley, right? So I think if there were people there and tribes that eventually coalesced into a civilization, the only place to live would have been along the Nile Valley, and indeed that seems to be what has happened. So all of these sites, that some of them I think may have existed during those pre-dynastic times, they were inherited, they were renovated, and they were lived in, and it became the sites of the dynastic Egyptian civilization, potentially with inherited artifacts, and not only that, but also cultural iconography, the actual look of the dynastic Egyptian civilization. So the sites that we know about, Giza and Karnak and Luxor, places like that, they're very hard to interpret. Like, they've been through thousands and thousands of years of construction, renovation, renewal, and then later on thousands of years of literally quarrying and destruction. People have been taking stone away from there, right up until probably less than 100 years ago. I think the interesting place to consider here is what about the ancient savanna, this ancient grassland with lake systems and rivers. Today we call it the Sahara Desert, but it wasn't always the case, and it's massive. The Sahara Desert, it's vast. It's generally almost entirely unexplored from an archaeological perspective, no matter what Flint Dibble claims or any of these other guys claim. The surface has not yet been scratched when it comes to truly exploring the Sahara. It's roughly the size of the Amazon basin. The Sahara is massive, and I think the opportunities for exploring it and using things like modern technology to do so could be very interesting. There's the emergence of space-based satellite technology that has the ability to look at least to some depth or into solid material. I think the application of some of these more broad stroke technologies to find what might have been ancient river system, ancient lake beds, and go look around places like that, I think that's probably our best chance of finding sites that not only might contain similar artifacts to what we see coming through the dynastic Egyptians, but it might also find sites that really are untouched from the perspective of the dynastic Egyptians, potentially find something that, wasn't inherited, wasn't renovated, and certainly wasn't destroyed and quarried. And this would be, I think, a really interesting place to go look. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this presentation today. I know it's a little bit different to my normal videos. I will definitely get back to producing my normal deep dive videos, but I wanted to share with you all a run through of the presentation that I did at the Cosmic Summit. I did this one a little differently to how I did it at the Cosmic Summit. I added in a bit more material. I took my time a little more. I apologize if I've been stuttering or umming and ahhing a little bit. This isn't something that is scripted like it would normally be, but again, I hope you enjoyed that presentation. Let me know what you think about it in the comments below, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.